An elderly Japanese man is reborn into a different reality, not the ordinary world, as the gifted, handsome 10-year-old son of an aristocratic family. He shares how he became extremely rich and truly happy. Until now, the main character had never made a mistake like that. A bearded man with a huge sword fell to the ground and said it was simply incredible, convinced no one in the world fought better with a sword than their young master. Cain Carl, the eldest son of the aristocratic Carlier family, was only 10 years old, but had become famous for his alchemy skills, and despite his childlike looks, it was hard to fool him, because inside he was a wise, experienced man. Cain grabbed his head and immediately realized someone was lying to him. Cain's training partner decided he had practiced with the sword enough and let him go. Luck put him in the body of a young man who had inherited his mother's looks, belonged to a noble family, and was still young. His life seemed like a fairy tale. Born into a noble family and blessed with such looks, his future seemed set. The world could be very unfair. The boy, only 10, already had this remarkable power. Able to command all the elements hidden deep in the earth, he could turn them into anything his mind imagined, revealing his special magic, earth alchemy. Plunging his hand into the ground, he channeled lightning and earth to forge a battle sword. Lifting the sword, he noticed it was exceptionally well made. The weapon had been forged using metals from the soil. Alchemy is an art that cannot create something from nothing. In this world, alchemy was used to make medicines and extract useful ores. For generations, the Carlier family helped the country fight epidemics and diseases by developing unique medicines and secret recipes, and the crown honored them for it. As the eldest son, Cain had to master both swordplay and alchemy, and thinking about that, he decided he still had time to nap until noon. Today was unusually pleasant, and the young man thought about his past life and how he used to stay late working at the office, only getting home at rush hour when life felt gloomy and exhausting. In this world, if you grew up right, you could live carefree. The hero rolled onto his side and thought this was his paradise on earth. All he could do was dream of getting a little older and finally tasting alcohol. After a while, the young master's daydream was interrupted by the sudden arrival of a talkative dog. The dog came up to the boy and said there was nothing to be done with this young master. Cain slept soundly, but the dog called out louder. Waking up, Cain immediately saw Zen. The dog was surprised to find him there and decided that a little warm water would finish waking him. The hero awkwardly thanked Zen for the help. He sighed deeply, remembering his idol, who had been broken. The cobalt-colored slave named Zen was 32. Looking at the young man, he thought Zen had grown lazy and remembered himself at that age, sweating on his brow and throwing himself into study and hard work. Once a local trader, Zen lost everything in failed schemes and became a slave, a wise, loyal, and attentive servant who was rarely loud or annoying. Zen understood Cain because the young master was probably having a hard time. Zen remembered that less than 2 weeks had passed since his respected grandfather died. Grandfather Leopold was a legend in the family. Over his life, he acquired large estates and earned the title of duke. Frankly, Mr. Cain was not very upset by his death, since they had never been close. He spent his first 3 years living with him on the Carlier family estates and has lived in the royal capital for the past 7. To everyone, Grandpa Leopold was a living legend. Cain wondered what would happen to their family when that era ended. After his grandfather's death, all the responsibilities would fall on his father's shoulders. He assumed he would be spared and planned to live quietly, enjoying life. Zendova, however, did not accept such carelessness. One day, Cain's father fell ill. Doctors diagnosed diabetes, gout, and hypertension. He believed his body had simply not withstood the constant late-night feasts and rich meals. His father looked like a seal washed up on the shore. Stricken by illness, he called Cain to his side. Cain's father was named Nicola Carlier and had just turned 50. Cain felt uneasy because his father looked so exhausted he seemed close to death. Louisa, a 42-year-old mother, asked the doctor what they should do next. The doctor said her husband's condition was serious, but reassured her that every illness can be cured with enough time and patience. When he realized he would have to care for his father, he grabbed his head and stood frozen in shock, as the worried doctor checked if he was all right. He tried to figure out what she was thinking, since many maids were nearby to help. Before he left, Cain asked his father to take it easy and rest well. Cain's father smiled and waved goodbye. Zero decided to stroll through the streets where everyone knew him. Merchants gladly invited the young gentleman to taste the freshly arrived juicy apples. Another vendor offered him fresh pastries. Cain enjoyed spending time at the manor, but walks through the busy market quarter gave him just as much pleasure. The city seemed to come alive there, and the air filled with the sense of wonderful treats. One merchant, holding a huge fish, beckoned the lord closer because the catch had been generous that day, and he wanted to prepare this fish and bring it to the manor. They spent all their time running the estate and never left its walls. The boy could not grasp how anyone could bear sitting inside four walls all the time. Zen knew that one day the young master would have to take on his parents' duties, and the boy was not ready for that. He angrily insisted he would never do that, but with his father so ill he would soon have to take on those duties more often. And Cain gave Zen a hard look to make it clear he preferred not to hear about it. Zen concluded that Cain had not changed at all. Cain still avoided new people and spoke only with merchants and servants. Cain shrugged and said the gap between nobles and common people was too wide, so real friendship was hard to find. I turned and saw Randolph, a salt merchant. I was genuinely surprised to see Randolph here, a well-known salt trader from the royal capital, and I asked what had brought him to a place like this. And Randolph laughed and said he always turns up in the most unexpected places. Cain noticed Randolph seemed to be loafing here, and Randolph, slightly hurt, replied that he was being insulted. The sun was still high, so it was too early to lie idle or sit in a bar, but it looked like Randolph really had a lot of free time, and Cain teased him that it was because he was still single. Men in the capital were in no hurry to marry, since many women were happy to keep their company without a ring on their finger. Randolph said he was looking for the right woman and would propose as soon as he found her. Cain knew this was only a common excuse and warned that time was passing and Randolph was no longer young, so if he kept delaying, he might end up an old rich man without love or marriage. Looking closer, he noticed the boy was saying something frightening, and he began to doubt his senses because the young gentleman was only 10 years old, and that worried him. Smiling, he remembered meeting many people like Randolph in a past life. His day passed and night came. That night his father called Cain into the room, his mother sitting beside him, and they both told their son they had long been waiting for him. Cain knew his mother's smile meant trouble. Cain looked at his mother with suspicion, hoping they were not planning anything bad. The girl laughed and turned away, not understanding why they would do such a thing. That made Cain even more uneasy. His father finally spoke and said they wanted to talk to him about the former princess of their kingdom. The parents were sure that marrying her would bring Cain only happiness. Angered by his father's words, he refused to consider a marriage of convenience. Only the memory of that girl remained, and he was sure he would never marry someone of such high status. 2 years ago, rumors said Cain was engaged to a princess from the Ramra family, and his parents were ready to marry him off for wealth and status. The father urged his son to agree, reminding him how much she liked him. But the young man pictured a young, beautiful woman and insisted on being allowed to choose his own wife. He also asked his mother to hold back her laughter because such behavior was inappropriate. The girl assured him she would never mock him. His mother, a simple actress in a theater troupe, constantly needed money. In the end, she married well and became an aristocrat. Her appetite for money and for profitable alliances with other families did not go away. She should not let memories of their first meeting cloud the present. The young man asked his father to at least let him choose his own wife, and his father noted his stubbornness. He turned to his mother, but his father said he had not been called to discuss a marriage to benefit the family. The young man said he did not hide his true nature. The father was more serious than ever and asked Cain for a man-to-man talk about important matters as father and son. Despite illnesses wearing down his body, Cain knew the situation was not as bad as it was being made out to be, and his father would recover. After the grandfather died, tax income from these lands stopped going to the royal treasury. As the Carlier family's eldest son, he had to settle the matter, and King was due to leave tomorrow to carry out his duties as lord. The news was a complete surprise. although his father had been sure his son would take it calmly, and in fact things turned out very differently. The boy tried to remind his father that he was only 10, but the father insisted the child was already quite grown and mature for his age. Asking him to go to the hospital, the father reassured him there was no reason to worry, because their lands, though smaller than those near the capital, are incredibly scenic, and the local food and wine are truly outstanding. 4,000 loyal warriors were already waiting for Cain in his holdings, along with the sincere and friendly residents of those lands. No matter how you ended up here, the link is in the description. As a young man, he was full of drive. If he had inherited his father's skills, collecting taxes would have been easy and quick. I suggested asking the neighboring lord to collect taxes from our people, but my father called the idea foolish. He warned that letting outsiders collect taxes could lose all our money. My mother agreed, saying this was serious and that only a family member, not just anyone, should handle the money. Cain had hoped they would choose someone more responsible, but his father was convinced Cain could handle the task, having always regarded him as a smart, capable heir and believing this kind of work suited him. On that day, Cain and Zen, accompanied by several soldiers, were already heading to the Carlier family's estates. After 3 days on the road, they reached their destination, a quiet village. Zini thought the young lord seemed indifferent to the local scenery, but the hero simply told her he liked it all. Captain of the guard. Granto Gride, a 22-year-old woman, stepped forward to address Lord Cain, not alone but accompanied by local residents who had come out to greet the guest in person. Everyone here admired him because he was the grandson of their former ruler, and Granto envied him. Cain was not pleased because he knew they would never let him go home. The hero was delighted with him and seemed to want Granto to stay and serve with him. Granto was confused and did not know what to say. He explained that he had been feeling very ill lately, especially with stomach trouble. Any change in his diet sharply worsened his condition. A whole night had passed since they arrived, so they should have stopped at least once to spend the night, and Grantel noticed the locals had been warned in advance to set up tents for them. But Zen felt there was more to it. The prince had to prepare to meet the new ruler because the hosts wanted to see him in person. But Mr. Leopold said there was no need to let the men rest, so the audience was set for the next day. It was hard, and as the heroes made camp, dusk was already falling outside. Then something suddenly broke the silence. She burst into the young gentleman's tent and shook him awake, hurriedly warning him of an attack by robbers and urging him to run immediately. The young man sprang up from his bed, sleep gone at once. Mr. Grant fought off hundreds of bandits on his own, and the boy could hardly believe his eyes because there were far too many of them. The hero fought in terror, realizing they had actually broken into someone else's territory. Zen confirmed it, and Cain still didn't understand why they were there. Escaping was more important than wasting time on such thoughts. The hero remembered they were supposed to face 25 heavily armed guards against 100 people weakened by hunger. Surprisingly, there were only 5 of them here. Stunned, he could not figure out where the other 20 guards had gone. Zen said they had run off, overcome by fear and panic. Cain could not believe these men had really been soldiers. Hired in the royal capital, these soldiers had no intention of dying for Lord Cain. The pay was too small to risk their skins, so in fear they ran off. Cain felt humiliated and could easily be killed by bandits in such a remote place. Guard Commander Granto, recruited in the royal capital, did not flee the battlefield only because his family lived nearby. Had he shown cowardice and fled, his relatives would have been executed for betraying the Carlier family, and he would have been blamed for failing to save Arb. Everyone knew there were only 5 nights of non-stop fighting left before the young lord fled the village. So Granto did not want to return here, and maybe some of the soldiers felt the same, though no one dared say it aloud. For Granto, victory or defeat no longer mattered when he ordered the men to advance. He was determined to take the enemy with him to the grave. Soldiers were shouting from the forest, and Zen begged the young lord to run faster. The young lord's father promised that 4,000 loyal knights would be stationed here and that the locals were kind and decent people. Cain could not understand where 100 bandits had come from in this area, or how anyone could collect taxes from people suffering from their raids. Angrily thinking of his father, he decided that as soon as he got home he would teach that seal a proper lesson. Kin cursed to himself, feeling that his legs no longer obeyed him. The hero did not even think of running. Now he saw himself as the local lord. His carriage showed the Carlier family crest, so the robbers knew exactly whom they were attacking. They would have been wiser to hide and avoid a fight, but in the end, Kin fled to save his life. Kane stopped to catch his breath but had no strength left to keep running, and his consciousness began to fade. Eyes closed, he heard a voice calling him and ordering him to get up. The boy had no idea what the voice meant. Yarrow sprang to his feet and waved irritably, ordering the unknown voice to be quiet. Yarrow was surprised to see an old man holding a torch who could not understand why Kane was there in the middle of the night, and the man even mistook the boy for a girl because he smelled nice. Sitting with his back to them, his pretty face, long hair, and a faint scent of perfume made them take him for a girl. The old man was not alone either. 4, maybe 6 others were with him. Realizing his combat skills were useless here, the hero froze. The old man calmed him, told him not to worry, and promised his support. Still, the hero had no idea what to do next and almost no time to think. Not knowing whose voice woke him no longer mattered. Remembering the land was rich in iron, he decided to use alchemy. An old man looked him over and asked if he was all right, noticing something was off about the so-called girl. To escape, he had to use the minerals, so he turned to alchemical magic, while everyone around could not understand what was happening as the ground beneath their feet began to explode. The hero scrambled up the tree, and at that moment the others noticed Kane had disappeared. There was no reason for him to fall, especially with the pursuers able to catch him again. Kane waited patiently until the group neared his hiding place and used alchemical magic. A powerful bolt of lightning tore through the trunk and struck everyone below. Using transformative alchemy, he made the ground erupt in electric sparks. The pursuers looked around, bewildered, as everything lit up and they could not understand what was happening. Lightning instantly became a grate that sealed the people inside an iron cage. 25 steel bars rose on each side and the pursuers began demanding that Kane release them. The bars were as long as the swords of the Age of Heroes, as if 100 blades had appeared at once. Kane was barely standing, but believed he was finally safe. His body grew heavier, and he had long since lost feeling in his legs. Crossing the river was unavoidable, but Kane felt only a deep cold as his body temperature fell fast. I walked a little farther and came to a huge spreading tree with a hollow inside. Climbing into it, the hero prayed that he would survive and not die there. The protagonist was asleep in a tree when he suddenly heard voices behind him, and fear gripped him that the same old men had tracked him down again. He jumped up from his seat and asked anxiously who had arrived. Embarrassed, he realized he had accidentally scared the child. The toddler first cried out in fear, then glared at Kane. The child clearly wanted to know who Kane was and why he was in someone else's garden. The protagonist looked at the boy in surprise and did not understand what it was about. Apologizing, he said he had gotten lost last night and ended up here by accident. The boy insisted this did not answer his question. Kane noticed the boy was about his height and had an idea for him. Surprised, the boy realized Kane was offering him his clothes, and the girl told her brother he looked much cooler now. The boy checked again that Kane really meant it, but Kane only smiled and firmly handed him the clothes. The hero decided to thank the hosts for letting him sleep in their garden and for the clothing swap, and putting on the boots he was pleased that they fit him perfectly. Silently, he apologized to the boys, because if he had not blended into the crowd, those people would have quickly exposed him. He waved goodbye and said he had to move on. The children never guessed where he was heading. Finally, Kane promised the adults he would tell them how the forest fairy had given him those things. Then he said goodbye to the boy, who waved back and reminded them they were all the same age as him. After a while, Kane left the forest and headed toward the village. Old, torn clothes and a strong smell fit his plan perfectly. Kane was sure he no longer looked like himself and hoped the bandits would mistake him for someone else and seize that man. To calm himself, he thought they would not kill the innocent man, but most likely only question and release him. Kane should have found his grandfather's mansion by now, but had no idea how to do it, so he decided to rest first and then ask the locals for the address. Turning onto his side, he suddenly saw someone's legs in front of him and jumped, rolled down the slope, and a woman's voice asked what he was doing there while he could not make sense of the strong smell of donkey dung. The girl in a maid's uniform laughed and apologized, saying this was hardly a place to rest. Only then did Kane realize she really was a maid. Apologizing that she had first mistaken him for a village troublemaker running from work, she gently pressed a handkerchief to his face, and Kane noticed her clothes looked quite fine. About 15 or 16, with pale, clear skin free of freckles or any spots, she did not look like an ordinary village servant. When she met Kane's gaze, she suspected something was wrong. She poked him lightly in the cheek with her finger, thinking she hadn't seen him in this village before. Kane waved her away and asked her to stop, and she laughed. That story also said one of his parents had worked at the Carlier estate, and when Kane heard about his grandfather's house, he jumped up and began asking the girl where the estate was and how she knew about it. With a smug smile, she said she knew the estate because she worked there and was just visiting her parents today before her shift. Looking closer, she noticed the young man was surprisingly handsome, yet he blushed and only asked for directions to the estate. She could not understand why the boy would go to the Carlier estate since he had said his parents did not work there. But he did not ask why she cared and only looked at her in confusion, and she laughed again, saying he was funny. Deciding the boy would struggle to climb the mountain alone, the girl suggested they go together. The boy gaped, feeling incredibly lucky, and she guessed he must be hungry since she lived nearby, so she offered to run home quickly and bring him something to eat. She had tea and sweets at home, so she could offer him something tasty. His mouth watered at the thought of food because he had not eaten anything since yesterday evening. It seemed like a great idea, but he paused for a moment. He wondered why the carriage was here and why it stood alone. Such blatant solitude looked odd. Realizing the risk of another attack on the road, he saw there was not even a guard nearby. Remembering the bodyguards, Granto, and the other soldiers, he suddenly realized Jen and the rest were not beside him. He wondered where Zen had gone, since they had been walking together moments before. He apologized, explaining he could not go with her because he had another urgent matter, but asked for directions to the mansion. Surprised to learn he could not go with her, she asked him to wait there. The girl ran to the carriage, grabbed the map, and returned. Reaching him, the maid handed the hero the map and said she was giving it to him. The hero thanked the maid sincerely and hurried on with his business, while the girl watched him go in surprise, wished him luck, and said goodbye. Noting that the young man with the cane was very polite, though rather odd, she realized that if the situation had stabilized, Zen would try to return to their camp and join the other soldiers. The hero regretted refusing the food 1,000 times, imagining the maid offering him sweets with his tea until his mouth watered, and he tried to drive away thoughts of the missed chance to return home and feel at ease, when, as he sank into daydreams, someone called the young master, and he immediately sprang up. It turned out to be Zen, and Kane apologized for running off and leaving his friend alone. Meanwhile, the young man did not notice at first when someone put a hand on his shoulder and called out asking about young Mr. Kane. Seeing blood on his body and palms, Kane panicked, but the soldiers calmed him and said he should not worry about them. The soldiers laughed loudly, admitting they hadn't had such intense training in a long time. But one of them couldn't tell where that courage came from. Kane thought the brigands had knocked out the last of his common sense. He approached Zan, gently stroked his head, and quietly asked for forgiveness. Relief washed over him. Everyone was unharmed, and most importantly, everyone had survived. He was lucky to meet them before the mountain pass, so they set off together for the Carl family estate. 5 days had passed since Grace and the other maids from wealthy families received their assignments from Mr. Kane. Zero did not understand why he had to change clothes, but Zen thought the new look suited him, and Granto swore loyalty to Lord Kane and sincerely apologized for all Kane had suffered because of them, which impressed Kane and prompted him to thank Granto for his work. They believed they could not atone for their sins, which Kane did not realize. He felt only gratitude for their help and planned to stay and carry out his duty as their guard. Barely holding back tears, she heard the boy jokingly reassure her that it was only make-believe, since it was clear Granto liked the place far less than Kane. Sebastian, the 65-year-old butler of the Carlier family, approached Kane, bowed deeply, and said it had been a long time since they last met. Sebastian hoped the young master recognized him, and Kane still remembered him as his butler. Even after 7 years, the meeting felt special to Sebastian. Kane explained his father had put him in charge of the estate, and now he needed Sebastian's help. He agreed and promised to help in every way he could, since Kane would be the estate's master only briefly and needed all the support he could get. The young master looked exhausted after the journey, so the other man suggested they discuss the matter later. Kane agreed, admitting he was indeed a bit tired, and Sebastian kindly asked him to follow. He knew that after a short rest, he would have to handle tax collection. Leopold, his grandfather, was spending his last days. Most of the work was done in Lynn Garden, not here. As his health steadily declined, great-uncle Earl Louis took over all his affairs. This big uncle was already elderly and ill, so Kane's father's decision to put him in charge of the territory and free the grandfather from further worry seemed entirely natural. For an ordinary 10-year-old, this would have been impossible, but remember that the body held the soul of a 35-year-old man. Kane was sure he could succeed here. A bright light suddenly flashed before his eyes, and someone greeted him. They greeted Mr. Kane with a low bow and genuine respect. Sebastian said proudly that these girls were the maids of their estate. There were so many maids that Kane could hardly believe they all actually worked in this mansion. Each one had striking beauty, and it was clear these maids were not ordinary. Among the maids, the oldest was 20, but some were only 5 or 6. And the hero could not imagine what duties a child that small could have on the estate. Some whispered that his grandfather, Leopold Carlier, the estate's legendary lord, was a master of alchemy who could successfully rejuvenate his maids and make them more beautiful. And Zen suspected something was wrong with the man, but Kane awkwardly asked him not to worry, and the hero also recognized one of the maids, who seemed familiar. Stepping closer, he met the maid's eyes, but she felt so embarrassed she looked away and tried to avoid his gaze at any cost. He trembled, and Sebastian grew worried because he thought something was wrong with the young master, but Kane reassured him that everything was fine. Other maids immediately asked what had happened to Elian because the young man had been watching her so closely. Kane remembered that no one had expected the boy from Roxu, who had once lain on the ground near the donkey dung, to become their new master. Sebastian bowed, promised to bring all the necessary papers about their estates, and asked her to wait here. When he returned and apologized for the delay, Kane was surprised by how many papers he had brought. From the whole pile of papers, he could only take a small part. Kane realized that simply reviewing the documents would take more than a day, so he asked for a brief explanation of why land taxes had stopped reaching the capital since autumn. Sebastian decided it would be easier to show what he wanted to explain, and asked Kane to follow him, but Kane did not understand, so Kane asked Zen to join, and Zen agreed. They descended the stairs. The protagonist noted how enormous the mansion was, and Sebastian agreed, saying Kane was clearly right. Led the heroes to the safe where the Carlier family's property and money were kept. They invited him in, and Sebastian opened the door for him. Kane was stunned to find the safe empty, and could not understand why it had been completely cleared out. Embarrassment swept over him, and he decided it was someone's idea of a joke. The last person replied that unfortunately it was no joke, and Kane felt genuine terror. By then they only had a debt of 500 million pounds left. Kane tried to picture the amount in yen, but still couldn't understand how anyone had built such a massive debt. The former lord was great at making money, but terrible at managing it. He could not understand how his grandfather, known as a legend and a respected administrator with an excellent reputation at the royal court, had left behind such debts. Kane could not understand it, even given his predecessor's legendary status. The former ruler was a valiant knight, always ready to answer the royal family's first call. His record included many feats, crushing a rebellion and driving the barbarians from the lands. The hero realized he was growing angry at the king's cynical actions. The ruler used innocent lives without remorse to achieve his own aims. That cruelty disgusted him, since past wars had not left such deep scars on people's souls. The Lord had never wanted to rule that way. He treated his people like his own children, waived their taxes, and paid them from his own funds. In bad harvest years, he opened the granaries and fed the needy, founded numerous shelters for orphans who lost parents in the war. He supported them with generous donations. Although people often mocked him, his grandfather had a strong reputation abroad, and merchants readily came to him offering their goods at favorable prices. The protagonist thought his grandfather spent all the money supporting the people on his lands, but that was not entirely true. The truth was more complicated because the current head of the Carlier family, Nicholas Carlier, forced the protagonist's father to send huge sums every year. Kane was stunned that his father demanded £5 million a year just to live in the capital. It was hard to believe the arrangement cost such an astronomical sum every year, but there was no other way. Grandfather paid taxes for his tenants, tried to make their lives easier, and regularly sent money to his only son, who spent it without hesitation and sometimes went into debt, forcing his father to pay his debts. The legendary ruler had lived his life that way. No matter how Kane looked at it, it felt like too much. Kane decided that once he was back in the capital, he would deal with the cursed seal. The young lord held back his emotions, followed the advice to calm down and realized it made sense. But one question remained because he was puzzled that all the maids and the man here were so young and unusually attractive, and he could not understand why or what it was connected to. Sebastian figured the girls could just be servants, so he decided it was better to see for himself than hear it 100 times. Peen and Zen exchanged glances and followed the butler. He stepped forward and asked Sebastian what he should do next. The butler stopped and held Zen at his side. Apologizing, he said he and Zen could not go any further. Kane still did not understand why. Only the lord could enter this part of the estate, so they let the young temporary lord go in. With nothing else to do, he agreed. Asking him to wait there, the dog warned the young lord to take care of himself. His tone made it sound like Kane was about to meet a monster, but Kane had no intention of running from danger. He walked further down the corridor and opened the heavy doors. The same estate stood before him, but it looked completely different. This part of the house was surprisingly clean and luxurious. He looked around and headed back toward the exit. Kane would call this the women's quarters of the house. Kane had guessed as much, though he had not expected the answer to be so obvious. Seeing the lavish dining table where charming girls sat enjoying tea, he smiled faintly. He wanted to go over and say hello, but for some reason the girls suddenly stood up from the table and walked off in different directions, leaving him confused and unable to understand what was happening. McCain recognized the same maids who had met him before, but this time they looked at him strangely. Their faces showed surprise and confusion, and their cheeks flushed with embarrassment. Their behavior and revealing clothes felt odd, and instead of doing their usual work, they just sat and drank tea, so it seemed the hero had entered a seedy den rather than a mansion. Sebastian was surprised by what was going on, but the butler said they were the young master's maids, and Kane knew exactly what to do because it was clear these girls were not real servants. It all depended on how he took it. Kane apologized for his unfounded anger because he simply lacked an explanation. In reality, it meant they also served as concubines, as Kane had suspected. A living legend, he was an honest man who was always generous to everyone around him. Nobles from neighboring principalities hoped to become related to such a distinguished man and sent their most beautiful daughters to his lands as concubines. Because of his high rank and desire to avoid conflict with neighboring rulers, he could not send the girls back, so he had to accept everyone sent to him and let them stay in his domains, taking each one without exception regardless of age or number of concubines. Rumors said Kane's father, Mr. Nicola Vizier, was not planning any more children, so the chance that Kane would have a brother or sister was almost zero. McCain had a strong chance because he was young and could already provide for an heir. Sebastian hoped the young man would not scare off the girls and insisted they would respond to his kindness and generosity. Kane, however, genuinely hoped Sebastian was not joking and felt he was still too young for such matters. When Kane asked how many concubines had lived here in total, he was told there were only 87 women, which surprised him. So he apologized to Sebastian, who already seemed to have had enough of what he'd heard and wanted to be alone with his thoughts to rethink what he'd seen. He left a debt of £500 million and 87 concubines. The whole territory was on the brink of collapse, and the treasury was nearly empty. The city of Udara owed the government 30 million yen and was still paying it off, and Kane had no idea how much longer he'd have to handle it. The young lord was taken aback by the size of the debt. The man reminded him it was 500 million, more money than he had ever seen in his life. Surprised, he looked at the young man and pointed out that many merchants in the royal capital handle even larger sums daily. Kane, also surprised, glanced at Zen, who simply confirmed it. Deciding important choices are best made in the morning, Kane had to eat first and sleep well. The top priority was to avoid making more enemies. After thinking about those words, he agreed that he needed the strength to handle it all. Finally, he said it was enough for today and time to rest. Stunned by the set table, he had only wanted to eat and did not expect to see anything like it. A variety of dishes awaited him, from chicken salad to avocado salad. One of them insisted on feeding him with a spoon, another handed him the soup, and the third carefully wiped his mouth with a handkerchief, noting that the gentleman had gotten dirty. The maids waited patiently for his next order, but Kane admitted he was already full. Heading into the bathhouse, he sat on the bench, unaware that others would swarm him like bees to honey, each eager to talk. He sighed heavily because he hadn't even managed to taste a single bite. Though others would expect him to enjoy the company of pretty girls, he really wanted peace and quiet. Leaving the bath, Ro realized he was even more tired after dinner, so Zen told him to just go to bed. Despite all the formalities, King said goodnight without ever realizing how luxurious his nightclothes were. Nothing mattered to him now, and the only thing he wanted was to fall onto the luxurious bed as soon as possible and finally rest. High ceilings, a huge bed, and a debt to match. Kane couldn't get it out of his head. In the middle of the night, the door to Kane's room creaked open. Holding his sword ready under his pillow, the boy pretended to sleep. He was sure Zen was dozing in the next room and would never go into his grandfather's room without knocking. He decided it was probably a peasant who had come to take revenge on the new lord for his indifference. Or it could be the same bandits who killed the knights outside. Maybe they were conspirators from the start. He had been ready and was only waiting for the stranger to come closer. A sharp cramp suddenly seized his leg, and he could not understand why it happened at that moment. It was probably fatigue after a hard day. It felt creepy, since this strange man had somehow managed to get under his blanket. The stranger believed Kane was asleep, so it was the perfect moment to attack. The hero did not hesitate. Lunging at the alien, he suddenly heard a woman's voice. He landed on something soft and gentle, and his cheeks instantly flushed. At that moment, an unusual sound reached his ears. The man shoved him hard, knocking him off the bed. The young man grabbed a lamp to see the stranger and find out what he had left in the room. The hero, seeing the girl before him, blushed, looked away awkwardly, and asked what she had been doing that night. The young man learned the girl had come to do her night task and had introduced herself as a newcomer. She said she was fully devoted to serving his master. Zero reminded her. He was only 10, and she probably knew that at that age it was too soon for such night duties. The girl grew embarrassed, blushed and lowered her eyes and quietly said that if she refused, she would be scolded and laughed at for failing her duties. She thought of Sebastian, and the butler still did not seem to understand that it was completely unnecessary. Zero asked the surprised girl to go back to her wing and promised he would talk to Sebastian. Not knowing how to respond, she began to cry, and Kane did not understand why, since he had not meant to hurt her. That was what made her cry. It made sense to Kane. They had lived that way for many years, and if the Lord rejected them, it would inevitably affect their reputation. He told her not to cry or apologize for pushing him away. Holding out his hand, he asked her to come closer because the estate was very cold at night and she could easily get chilled. When she sat beside him, the hero felt a little embarrassed. To ease the tension, he asked her name again, and the maid introduced herself gently. He began to suspect why Sebastian had sent that girl to him. Kane had been watching her closely since morning because she looked familiar, and the other maids had likely seen her head to him. Faced with that, he could not just let her go, so he asked her to stay and spend the night with him. The bed was big enough for each to lie comfortably on their side without bothering the other. And when Kane saw her eyes fill with tears again, he grew nervous and could not understand why she was crying. They sat down, and the young man had no idea what a girl her age was thinking. He assumed that living in a remote, gloomy place had warped her view of the world over time. At heart, he was a simple older man trying to be gentle and respectful toward her. She still looked too young for such things. He quietly apologized to the young girl sleeping across from him. That morning, the surprised alien sat up in bed, realizing she had fallen asleep here, and that most likely nothing had happened between them. It was Aylin's first night sharing a bed with a man, but they had given her to the estate only after Paul Leopold was already too old for such pleasures, and Aylin had long prepared herself mentally for this possibility. Completely unaware, He slept peacefully with an utterly innocent look. The girl puffed her cheeks in anger, watching the young lord closely. The moment she drifts into her thoughts, the other maids start asking her for every detail. Everyone pressed for details and immediately asked Aylin whether she had really taken the boy's virginity. The girl blushed and could not understand how Linda had dared to ask that. Mother gave a slight smile and suggested that Gertruda might want to go with Aylin to the lord, but Gertruda quickly waved her hands and insisted she had not said that. Curious about how much dignity this unacknowledged lord had and how out of place he looked, she hoped they were all right while another maid flushed with shame and finally thought Lindy could have her mouth washed with soap and water. Celine was lucky to be the first in bed with him, but now it is time for others to feel that same closeness. Grace looked at her in surprise, and Linda was completely at a loss and could not find words to say to her friend. People said Elaine was lucky. The young lord chose her for the first milking. In reality, by tradition, the well-off concubines should have gone first, not some poor woman like Elaine. Elaine frowned at the maid and lowered her eyes in confusion. Grace thought the maid was flattering her figure. She smiled aloud, understanding why Elaine was so displeased. Aylin only once won Kane-san's favor, and Grace hoped she would not grow arrogant because of it. One maid thought Grace was upset because Mr. Kane had not even noticed her, and Eileen looked at bold Scarlet with fear, while another maid pointed out that the young master had personally summoned Grace and Aileen, so they should not argue with those who lost. The girls still hadn't returned to the wing, and Elian wondered where they'd gone and what they were doing, since it was the first time one of the maids had been delayed this long. Suspecting something had happened to them, Aylin decided to ask the young master directly, since they had been gone too long, and that was the only way to find out what happened and where they were. He replied briefly that it was an abbreviation, but Aylin did not understand what he meant. In short, the boy gave them to the capital's traders to arrange marriages, and Aylin jumped up, ready to do the same, but Kane quickly calmed her. The girl asked the maid to listen carefully and said their estate was on the verge of bankruptcy. In fact, they were already bankrupt. Facing financial difficulties, he decided to marry off Grace and 45 maidservants to cut costs. She was stunned to learn that keeping 87 concubines cost about £5 million a year. Half of that went on cosmetics, so he dismissed the biggest spenders. When Aylin found out, she became an unwilling accomplice, and Kane watched her with satisfaction. He gave Eileen even more work, and she asked him to trust her. Lad then turned to Zan, saying he had his own concerns, and the dog listened closely. Polyopole the Great died, and Nicola is gravely ill. Most concubines are out of work, so Cain decided to ask his merchant contacts in the capital if anyone was looking for an attractive bride. Some merchants agreed to take certain concubines as wives, or so they believed, since girls from the provinces were seen as less demanding and simpler at home than those raised in the capital. In just 3 days, Grace and 45 other concubines were successfully married off to wealthy merchants from the capital. Only 42 maidservants remained, and he had cut their number almost in half, so most of the girls are about 15 or 16. One is not yet 10, and they are all roughly his peers. He could make more cuts, but that might upset other family members and lead to resistance. Hiding it was not that hard, but Kane did not want to deal with the consequences, so he dropped the idea and turned his attention to other things. Only the maids, Sebastian, and a few guards remained at the estate, but it was impractical to keep them there. The guards were already elderly. Most were over 50. By then, 4 young warriors had already returned to the capital, leaving him with only the former cobalt merchant. The hero struggled, staring intently at the Zen, and the dog immediately sensed something was wrong with the young master. For some reason, he disliked the shape of that Zen. He rushed and did not even have time to change out of his work clothes. At that moment, the hero had a brilliant idea. Kane had one special assignment for Zen, and Zen was eager for a chance to prove himself to his master. All the books in the library had to be sorted. Only those about managing the estate were to remain, and the rest were to be removed. Kane was also going to give Zeno the storeroom key. The storeroom was to hold his father's unwanted belongings and the Carlier's family relics, and each item had to be appraised, so Zeno was surprised to be entrusted with the decision. Smiling, he admitted that back in the royal capital he had learned he was not so easy to fool, and when he trusted Zen, sparks of admiration appeared in Zen's eyes. Gus trusted him and immediately set to work on the matter. Gus stretched, ready to inspect his lands. As soon as he thought that, clouds rolled in, rain began, and a storm broke out. He stepped outside and was stunned when rain poured down as if from a bucket, and he could not understand why such a downpour had started so suddenly. The rain was so heavy that leaving the estate would be foolish, as Sebastian had warned the master. All his plans were ruined at once. The boy felt it was much colder here than in the capital and shivered. Sebastian put a blanket over him and told him to warm up in his rooms. Cain sat by the fire, puzzled that the room felt so cold. Sebastian offered to make him tea. The young master thanked the butler and accepted. A powerful flood destroyed several villages, but the warehouse storing the autumn harvest was hit hardest and the floodwaters destroyed it completely. Seeing the extent of the damage on the kingdom's map, he realized the situation had become a nightmare. Bankruptcy was only the start, and now it felt like he had entered a game of exploring territories on the highest difficulty. Security remained uncertain, and Cain did not know when bandits would attack again. He had no means to live, no support from the townspeople, no reliable vassals, and was burdened with heavy debts. If the situation were truly hopeless, he would admit it even without knowing alchemy. Lost in thought, he did not notice Alien bring Mr. Kinsoma tea. Apologizing, he asked Sebastian and Alien to leave him alone with the guest. Lacking knowledge of the terrain at that moment, he understood its nature, and was sure they could get out of the situation. The hero dreamed of a screen showing the area's stats, like in video games. It would be great if he could control the area as easily as in a game. A bright glare hit Cain, and he instinctively covered his eyes against the blinding light. Cain opened his eyes and saw a table before him showing the entire situation in his kingdom. She was even more stunned by the little angel who explained that the table showed the current state of his family's holdings. Fear seized him, and he tried to guess who this mysterious girl was. Then he swung his arm sharply to grab her, but the angel was already behind him again. At first, Arrow thought it was a new kind of butterfly, but butterflies do not talk, and the angel said that was rude, calling him a petty bungler and adding that out of decency, Seiki could at least compare her to a butterfly. He mistook her for an insect, said he was busy, and told her to leave, even hinting that maybe everything she said had been only a dream, while the little girl had spoken quite sensibly, and that was how he repaid the god who saved his life. He could not believe she was really a deity and assumed it was a clever joke, but the little angel only smiled mysteriously and insisted she was telling the plain truth. She had once been the mother of the goddess of Carlier, Opariah. Little Cain became the new lord of these lands. She blessed him to help him flourish and settle this land. This was the first time the young man had heard of such goddesses, and Opariah was surprised he did not remember her since she had saved his life in the woods. The hero remembered that earlier, while wandering the forest, someone had tried to wake him. He recalled her persistent voice pulling him from sleep, and now everything seemed to make sense. Exhausted, he assumed he was delirious again, and when the girl declared she was a deity, he wondered what she wanted from him. She was the guardian of these lands, a mother goddess who wanted her home to prosper, and Cain understood her, so he asked for her help to overcome this trouble. But she calmly replied that she had already done everything she could for him. The goddess did not understand what the girl meant, and asked to see the map of the area the girl had created. Cain replied that the panel would not make him money and asked for a cheat skill from the classic class to get rich quickly. The girl admitted she did not have such a skill and could only offer some good advice, which Cain dismissed as pointless. Reputation among the residents determined how much people trusted the ruler of the land. It was his personal glory, how his subjects spoke of him. The health rating measured the level of safety in his territory, and the flood protection rating showed whether rivers stayed in their channels or if flooding was a threat. Agriculture, trade, and business on that land stayed at an industrial level, but Cain felt his numbers were not that low, so for comparison, he chose one of the most successful regions in southern Bartolomea where the indicators exceeded 80, making his results mildly encouraging. These lands were the least important in the Romp Kingdom and sat at the bottom of the hierarchy. But Cain knew worse places existed, and Opariah, the patron goddess of the region, wanted him to develop the territory. If he puts in effort, his results will keep improving, otherwise they will stay at the lowest level. He developed these lands, step by step bringing them to prosperity, while she raised her own status. It was a very profitable deal. Kane noticed she spoke well, but only he understood she would do nothing useful for the region. On the 7th day, the rain finally stopped. Sebastian asked the young gentleman where he was headed, and the young man replied that they had already lost too much time and it was time to set out to explore the Carlier family's lands. Needing a guide, he asked Sebastian if he knew anyone familiar with the area. Stunned, he saw an alien who could help him. She turned out to have been born here and decided to be his guide, showing him all the local sites. Finally, the girl agreed to help because others were counting on her. But Sebastian reminded the young lord that he could not allow him to go alone without proper escort. The young man believed the guards would only draw unwanted attention and might spark a fight. But Sebastian ordered his men to search the area, and the next day the boy would be able to go about his business alone. Zero said it was unnecessary, and that he would just walk the grounds without doing anything special. Sebastian Bod insisted, asked him to at least take his grandson, and had a horse prepared for them both. Kane, a little embarrassed, agreed. The Duke said he would soon leave the house and put Zen in charge while he was away. The dog asked them to trust him. Zen and Kane waited another half-hour for the girl, and it felt far too long. She apologized for the delay and said she was ready to leave. Seeing Aylin in her coat, the boy smiled awkwardly and suggested they leave at once if she was ready. They saw a man already waiting by the horse. Kane thanked the stableman for a job well done. The man wished the young lord a good day in return. Kane apologized for interrupting and asked where Sebastian's grandson was. To his surprise, he learned that this man named Jeff was the grandson. Smithman was 30 and he was Sebastian's grandson. Sebastian had said his grandson was one of the youngest guards on the estate. But in appearance, he looked more like a gorilla than a professional bodyguard. His impressive build made him stand out, and he clearly had more experience than the older knights. The man assumed the girl had come to escort the young lord, but Aylin said she would travel with him. Once everything was settled, Jeff smiled, picked up the two surprised boys, and said it was time to go. He quickly put them on the horse and said everything was ready. Kane and Elian began to feel uneasy about him, as he had plenty of strength but seemed to lack common sense. Laughing, he explained that he looked after the garden and the estate, so serving as a simple groom did not suit him. Actually, his role was more like a gardener guard. The man wondered why he needed a sword when no enemies or threats were expected. He had plenty of free time, so he gladly chose to tend the garden. Luckily, Jeff was in such a bad way that Kane feared he had frostbitten something important. But Jeff told him not to worry, saying that as long as he kept moving, he would not freeze, and asked the men to hold him tightly on the horse so he would not fall. He sat behind Kane and felt a pleasant mix of softness and firmness at his neck. Pressing against Kane, she apologized for rarely riding. Her gentle features seemed to soften Kane's heroism, but Aylin accidentally closed her eyes and he asked her to stop. At 10 years old, he realized he still felt like a real man inside, and the thought fascinated him even with his eyes closed. So he asked Aylin to take her hands off his face because he could not see anything that way. After apologizing, she finally let the hero go, and he told her to calm down, assuring her everything was fine. Jeff laughed, and the hero noticed she had placed her hands differently, which she confirmed. Wherever she put her hands, he still felt the touch of her breasts. A mysterious man with a shabby appearance and a cold, piercing stare appeared on their path, and Kane could not understand how the man could walk in the freezing air in tattered rags, all smeared with mud. A local man, skin and bones and leaning on a stick, could not believe his eyes. This place really was in its final days. They reached a half-ruined, half-dead village, and Kane decided it was enough, so he told Jeff they were going back. The girl was surprised because they had not explored anything yet, and Kane only apologized to her. Pearl pointed out they had not even visited the village and were already heading back, but Kane insisted he had to see the harsh reality for himself. And even using this village as an example, the damage from the bridles was much worse than he had imagined, so Kane assumed the same had happened to every village in the country. No point in wasting time visiting every village and seeing the same scene again and again. Better to return quickly and start taking at least some steps to improve the situation. Smiling, she admitted the hero was truly kind. Those actions and words could melt any woman's heart. After grabbing Kane by the head, she let go immediately and apologized. Kane paid it no mind because such behavior was normal for her. Back at the estate, the hero could think of nothing but how urgently he needed money. To raise the money, he had to start somewhere. There wasn't a single coin in the estate or among the locals. There was only one place that had what he needed, so it was time to place the order. Tell Sebastian not to let anyone in because he will be busy preparing documents, and ask him to call Simon, who should be in the library now. They called Kane forward and told him to bring the code of laws. For the first time, he helped prepare documents and picked up a pen. A knock came at the door and Kane let Alan in. Apologizing, she said she knew he was busy but still brought him tea. Payne thanked her and said he'd drink it later because he didn't have time. Needing to focus, he asked her not to bother him for a while. The girl clearly had another request, so the hero asked what had happened. Alan offered to help, but the young man told her to rest. Unable to help, she asked permission to stay nearby and support Mr. Kane. Arrow asked her to do anything as long as she did not disturb him, and Alan agreed without hesitation. After a while, the hero grew so tired that he fell asleep at his desk. Alan decided to wake Mr. Kane and leaned toward him carefully. Opening his eyes, he did not at first realize where he was, and suddenly saw a woman's striking curves in front of him. Shocked, he jumped to his feet. Wrapped like an animal in a soft, fragrant blanket, he felt his heart suddenly calm. She paid no attention to the fact that the person before her was an old man. At 15, the girl already showed an unusually strong maternal instinct toward him. He understood that this came from his childlike body, but the situation still felt odd. She could not resist that kind of care. There was still paperwork to finish. Kane chose to relax a little longer, lying on the alien woman's lap. That night, Jeff, Eileen, and Kane set out for the capital, timing their trip to arrive at dawn and avoid attracting bandits. Of course, that was the main goal. They had promised the boy they would leave so fast no bandit would even think of catching them. Jeff found it funny and laughed. Worried about Kane, she wanted to go with them to the capital, but the hero reminded her the trip was no pleasure, and its main goal was to raise funds to develop the lands, so he relied on Alan's support. At dawn, the crew of Jeff, Alan, and Kane reached the capital of the Kingdom of Ramers. Alan was impressed by the capital's grandeur because it was her first visit to the city. Jeff had been here several times with his father, so the novelty did not excite him. Kane did not share their feelings and viewed everything calmly and matter-of-factly. Today, the city was unusually crowded, and the heroes figured a festival was probably happening. Alan guessed the capital was always this hectic. Kane noted there are always lots of people and money here, so they decided not to waste time and go submit their application. Payne didn't notice he had accidentally bumped into a passerby, who grumbled that the peasant should watch where he was going. A burly, muscular man stood in front of him, convinced the boy had never been taught to apologize to his elders. Kane felt like he was facing another thug and had no idea what to do. The hulking man seemed even bigger than Jeff. Kane could not imagine he would need protection here. Kane glanced at Jeff, and the passerby took them for friends. Jeff froze, silent and still, and the big man assumed he was frightened just by seeing him. Eileen approached him and apologized for her younger brother, saying the boy did not mean to offend him. The stranger smiled calmly and admitted his own older sister was smarter than Kane. Swallowing hard, he promised to look the other way if she spent the day with him. The girl, flustered, turned to Lord Kane for advice. Until the last moment, he avoided the fight, but then saw there was no other choice. Zero asked Jeff to deal with him, and Jeff became furious. He could not understand how the young man dared to do that. Clenching his fist, he promised to show him how people behave in the capital. Jeff hit the partisan hard on the arm, which made him scream across the city center. The man warned him sternly not to touch the boy. Surpassing Jeff in every way, the man sternly ordered him to let him go. Jeff felt he had gone too far. Alan froze, thinking it was very cool. Jeff thought the townspeople were too weak and asked Kane why he had not intervened right away if he knew he was stronger, but Kane had earlier forbidden him to step in, so Jeff decided to handle it himself. In the end, Jeff had to admit he had underestimated his opponent and that Sebastian had recommended him for a reason. Thinking of his grandfather, he smiled uncertainly. Though Sebastian was already quite old, Jeff still could not beat him. Kane was stunned and could hardly believe it. Soon the royal knights arrived. Seeing the aftermath of the fight, they immediately began questioning the heroes. Kane recounted every detail to them. The knights understood at once and promised to handle the situation themselves. The heroes needed some time, so Kane suggested the others return to their duties. He traveled to the capital to negotiate with local merchants, spending a sleepless night on the road. It was nearly impossible to trade in these lands because taxes were so high, and it would take about 10 years before trading could be done properly. Capital traders were said to have sharp eyes and to spot at once what was happening in the country. That was probably true, but Kane had no intention of spending money on them. The girl, however, clearly did not understand what it was about. I was genuinely surprised when the guy said they would get that money from the traders for free. Will the Merchants Guild really just give them the money? They could not understand how this was possible, or why the Trade Guild would simply give them money. Besides, they had nothing to do with the Carlier family's elixirs. It's hard to put into words, but Kane assured her he hadn't come here without a clear plan. She realized that Kane had long been preparing the documents he had worked so hard on. Hearing shouting nearby, the heroes saw a large group of soldiers. These soldiers did not look like ordinary flag bearers, and they kept shouting something about a descent. A merchant cart was heading for the castle, and Jeff had never seen anything like it. 8 horses pulled a huge carriage, a truly impressive sight. Judging by the crest, it belonged to the Nas family, the richest merchant family in the capital. These merchants typically had close ties to the royal family and supplied them with luxury goods. A sudden thought hit him, and before Aylin and Jeff could react, Kane had already disappeared from sight. Screams rose as the crowd shouted, begging someone to stop the boy who was about to be run over by the carriage. Jeff could hardly believe the young gentleman standing before him was the very one. Terrified, he shouted at the young gentleman who plunged headfirst under the horse's hooves. The carriage swerved sharply off the road and nearly stopped. Jeff and the girl shouted after the gentleman who vanished into a cloud of dust. She could hardly believe her eyes and had no idea what had made Mr. Kane act that way. Nobody ever figured out what had happened or where the boy had gone, since there was not even a trace of his body. People guessed the impact had thrown him, or he had ended up under the carriage wheels. He told the girl to stay put and set off to look for the carriage, also saying where the young gentleman's body might be. They were about to take him when someone called to the boys. Mr. Kane was underground, trying to get out. The girl looked closely and saw his hand sticking out from under the dirt, and Jeff froze, confused. Emerged from under the ground just in time and immediately felt the reed strike his backside. To everyone's surprise, the hero pulled a black cat from beneath the ground that he had just rescued. Fine noted it had been extremely risky and joked to the cat that it had almost become a cutlet. Rodiganist was pleased to have rescued the black cat and expected Lord Meow to owe him even in his sleep. But the cat hissed in displeasure and was accidentally struck by Kane's lightning. It slipped from his hands, and now he cannot apologize. It was only ordinary alchemy, not meant to hurt him. If the code understood everything, it turned its gaze to the hero. A deep sigh escaped him because he had risked his life to save her and decided the cats were heartless. When the boys saw the cats following him, they called to him. Tears in his eyes, he ran to the young master and gently lifted him into his arms, hoping Kane was all right and unharmed. The hero told Jeff to calm down and let him go, assuring him everything was fine. She could not believe her eyes when Mr. Kane threw himself under the carriage wheels to save a cat. Clutching his head, Kane could not even react when he saw a cat in the carriage's path, and as an alchemist with great power, he felt he had to try with all his strength to save its life. He noticed tears in Alina's eyes but could not understand why she was crying. She tried to calm down and asked Kane not to do that again. The hero promised to try to restrain himself, but he knew he could not keep that promise. Watching her tears filled him with unshakable anxiety. All he could do was apologize to Mr. Kane for not being able to help. Kane felt he had to apologize to everyone for making them worry. Jeff was relieved everyone was okay, but Elian's heart was still racing with anxiety. Offering them tea to rest, he settled in with a cup and said this restaurant was for aristocrats only, and Kane was sure no one could overhear them here, so if the heroes had questions, now was the time to ask him. She remembered he had planned to ask the Merchants Guild for donations, but she still did not know exactly how they would do it or where they would go first. The hero apologized, admitting he should have told them all the details sooner. Before going to the Trade Guild, he wanted to speak with a few influential people. He was surprised because he had no idea who it could be. Payne explained that there are people who will help complete the paperwork properly, Submit to the legal commission a petition for tax exemption or a refund of amounts paid. Her face looked confused, and Kane could tell from her expression that the girl really knew almost nothing about this. Merchants never give away money for nothing. If the Merchants Guild officially donates to their lands, that is a different matter. Reducing the taxes the capital demands is not even being discussed. An announcement said taxes on these lands will be cut over the next 10 years to allow time for development. Much work lies ahead, including negotiations with the guild and getting a declaration from the college, and the girl worries the process could drag on. He smiled and admitted she was right. Organizing all this was not easy. He already had a few ideas, and more important, there was no rush, so they would stay in the capital a few more days. Today, the main character visited the capital of the Kingdom of Romer by the Law Council. Alan had never seen the place before and asked Kane if it was really the same council. The hero smiled and confirmed that many important agreements are made here every day. He walked up to the reception desk and introduced himself as Kane Carlier, saying he had a prior appointment. The receptionist politely asked to see his documents, immediately noticed a family crest on them, then asked him to wait, and promised to call him in shortly. They saw plenty of space inside, yet it did not feel crowded, and the only explanation was that entry was allowed only to chosen nobles, and not to all of them. They were led into one of the spacious rooms, and Kane decided they should wait there. When someone was about to speak to the hero, Kane asked what had happened. She probably felt out of place, especially after seeing the scale and importance of the matter. He admitted he would have been bored without her, and at least he had pleasant company. Without her, he would have no one to talk to. Kane looked at Jeff with a sullen gaze as Jeff had fallen asleep sitting up. Kane thought he could sleep easily if Alina were not here. Smiling, she reminded them that Jeff had driven the crew all night, and the boy admitted she was right. She asked for leniency because Jeff had done his duty and could now rest. The girl looked frightened and told Kane it was better not to know how Sebastian would react to seeing his grandson in that state. Kane felt uneasy and could not understand why every time he mentioned Sebastian, people reacted so strangely. She literally trembled and realized some things are better kept to herself. Aelin noticed something and was instantly distracted from the conversation. Recently rescued by Lord Kane, Lord Mal caught the hero's eye by standing out against the white columns. The girl noticed him in time and earned well-deserved praise. For some reason, the black cat stared at them but did not enter the room. The girl watched the strange creature in surprise, and the boy thought that if influential people saw it, they would immediately throw it out. Yet he still could not understand where this touching feeling came from. He pictured a sweet couple petting a kitten, and from the outside it looked very touching. He tried to remind himself they had come here on important business, and the alien was only 15 or 16, so such thoughts wouldn't even occur to him. She noticed the cat run off and wondered where it was headed. The hero guessed it was just looking for an exit, but the girl disagreed, saying the cat was really trying to find Mr. Kane to thank him for saving her, though it was too shy to come closer. Puffing out his cheeks, he decided Eileen was telling another story. Kane and his servants waited a long time for the summons, and even Jeff woke up during that time. After a while, a hooded man entered their room, told Mr. Kane someone was already waiting for them, and asked them to follow him. After thanking them, he realized that if not for his urgent need for money, he would have left long ago. The man looked at Jeff and stopped him, saying guards are not allowed in the office. Jeff was about to object, but Kane calmed him and asked him to wait here. Eileen and Kane followed the man who cracked the door and invited them inside. On his way to the office, Kane noticed the black cat again, quietly following him from around the corner. Earlier, the animal seemed to have run off toward the exit, and Kane could not understand why it was here. He couldn't help thinking the cat might actually like him. Entering the room, the heroes saw the kingdom's legal advisor, Romers, a portly, rough-looking, rather unpleasant man who seemed extremely irritable. Tension hung over the Carlier family, especially around Kane, and his arrival and gaze made the protagonist feel uneasy. Zero wants to talk with him about a tax reduction based on a donation from the Trade Guild, under paragraph 3 of Article 24 of the Commercial Law. The advisor thought agreeing would be a sensible move. He noticed the fat man wasn't even listening to him. The advisor made it clear he was busy. Willing to help, he first wanted to know what he'd get in return. He had heard about corruption in their kingdom before, but did not expect to face it now. They could not offer much, but they prepared a small payment for the time spent. Kane asked the girl to hand the coins to the advisor. The advisor accepted them calmly, and the girl stepped forward to give the money. He noted that despite his youth, Lord Kane understands all matters well and deserves praise. The advisor accepted the pouch and noted that the small sum would only pay for a bit of fun with colleagues and was clearly not enough to assemble a working group for even 3 days. Zyro was furious because he had already given him £100,000 and the greedy man still wanted more, but Kane tried to restrain himself as best he could, and the man explained that he and his colleagues usually visited top-class places, though maybe one of his less experienced, less professional acquaintances would agree to help them. Realizing they had very little money left, he knew a small contribution would hardly satisfy anyone. Still, the stout man decided to ask for more to please everyone. Hearing this, Kane tried hard to stay calm. A man's request to borrow a girl for a few nights sent a chill down Kane's spine. Kane saw no fair deal here, and the thought of that lout treating her like a toy filled him with deep anger. It was hard for him to understand how that fat man had the nerve to act so boldly. Kane thought even cutting him up would not be enough. Such a worthless creature should be left to the fish. Kane would have gladly done it, but he refused to break off the talks or accept those terms. He walked around the table, kept his emotions in check, put on an innocent face, and asked the advisor to understand his position, while the fat advisor inwardly thought it unlikely Lord Kane would refuse such a petty request. He knew she was his confidant, aware of many details about their family, so he had no choice. The advisor, however, doubted her role was only that of a confidant and smirked. The advisor could not believe that such a young girl had been given such a difficult task, especially with their lands in such a dire state. But a newcomer suddenly interrupted the conversation. She decided and told Mr. Kane and the advisor that she accepted his terms. Convinced that only Mr. Kane could save their lands, she would gladly make a small sacrifice to help. The advisor was delighted and said she serves Lord Kane well because she learns quickly, so he suggested they discuss their abilities at his estate, and to prove it, he gestured for the girl to come closer, breathing heavily and repeatedly demanding she move even nearer. He decided it was enough. This scoundrel hadn't just dared to insult the Carlier family, but had also attacked Alien. He had been patient for a long time, but he would not let anyone so much as touch that girl. Suddenly, someone else rushed past him, and loud shouts came from behind the door. A stern voice ordered the pig guards to stop and not to disturb the order within the walls of the law academy. The advisor stirred, apparently well aware of who stood behind those doors. An explosion sounded, and Kane slammed nose first into the ground while Aelin screamed and covered her ears. The stern man in the hat decided the advisor was unlucky today, but it was a truly lucky day for the boy. The advisor was drenched in cold sweat, unsure how he had ended up here or what was happening. Ruth, a noblewoman of Chantres Marin who had just turned 27, once heard a friend whisper about the sly tricks he was playing on the children, and she could not ignore it or walk on by. He insulted the curator, claiming he runs the college and will leave these children with nothing by exploiting their helplessness and lack of money. The advisor argued the college would have long since collapsed if it relied only on the meager coins they received, and that he only got donations for his diligent work. The girl refused to listen and sharply ordered him to be quiet, reminding him he had almost forced her to carry out his shameful demands. Last warning: do not think the kingdom will let you get away with causing chaos. The advisor warned him he would face harsh punishment for such actions. The advisor saw Lady Maran as a court sorceress and a magic teacher in a special unit, but he felt that gave her no right to meddle in his affairs. She only smiled slyly at his anger, finding it amusing, and he was sure he did not have to obey her because he answered only to Mr. Richard and could even report her to the Minister of Labor, while she had no idea that this minister was far scarier than the princess herself. Alan was taken aback, saw the swineherd go suddenly pale, and guessed Kane knew the girl, who came from a renowned family of hereditary mages that served the crown and was widely known among the nobility. The advisor had no idea she was a relative of the princess and did not realize what he had gotten into. Mantra threatened that if he did not kneel at once, lift his fat backside and beg for mercy, he should not expect an easy death. The advisor began to question her, and Marin felt as if death itself had entered the room. She said firmly that Princess Octavia, whom she serves, despises vice and bribery most of all, and that scoundrels like this advisor anger her the most. With a sly smile, she suggested he imagine what would happen to him if the princess found out about his deed. The advisor fell at her feet, begged forgiveness, and swore he would never do it again, pleading for mercy, which pleased the girl. Guilt froze on his face. He couldn't believe what he had heard. Kiggy grumbled and pleaded for mercy, but the girl only reminded him how many innocent people he had already cheated. Despair deepened on his face, and he quickly promised the guards he would never do it again. He gave the guard a smug look and asked how he should behave next. The guard said he must follow all her orders, which only made him angrier. Marin warned that a simple apology would not atone for his guilt and declared a real war. It seemed Mar was the black cat that had just slipped past me, and the unexpected Kane, heading toward him. And now she moved up to the geyser's face and threateningly extended her sharp claws. While the advisor begged her to stop, she scratched his whole face and then told her dear Noir that some spots on his face were still untouched, and she was not satisfied. Guards rushed to the scene to find out what was happening, and Marin explained that Noir had just caught a corrupt official in the act and suggested the guards stay to watch how the sentence would be carried out. Completely trusting Miss Marin, the guards believed her when she said he was a criminal. No one objected, which surprised Aylin and made her assume she was quite popular. Then Marin asked the guards for paper and a pen, and they immediately complied. Marin picked up the sheet of paper and instantly understood everything. Marin laid the paper on the back of the half-conscious advisor and noted that only the stubborn man's signature remained. Seeing he had finally collapsed, she ordered the guards to take him away. Marin put him in the guards' care, and they immediately carried him out of the room. A girl with a cat on her hat greeted baby Kane, and it seemed like a sign of thanks from the Noirs. Acting only on her mistress's orders, she surprised Kane when it turned out she had accidentally saved Miss Marin's friend. He handed Kane the document and, hopeful, said he expected her to repay him for saving her during the war. Kane could not believe her eyes. Convinced he would get the contract with no effort. Realizing he had to keep his dignity since they were aristocrats, he bowed and thanked Roof-sama, even though it was their first meeting. When he asked to introduce himself, the girl immediately told him to be less formal. She already knew the boy was Kane, the eldest son of the Carlier family who had saved her friend from being run over by the Nas family's carriage, so no further information was needed. He still seemed a little awkward, and the girl was surprised that he was only a boy yet so diligent. Varen felt that even though she had just saved the girl and the important document, she still owed him. Chantress decided that he wanted to save her himself, and Kane felt awkward. She simply smiled, thinking nothing could hide from her gaze, and that was enough. Marin winked and said she would find out whatever she needed. The boy handed the document, and the main character thanked her. Zero had already figured out that Noir was a black cat and a friend of the witch, but the girl insisted Noir was actually a modest woman, and Noir was very grateful to Zero for saving her, but too shy to thank him in person. So she followed him, and Kane was stunned, and realized Elian had been right. Seeing the war from that angle was new to Marin, and he seemed to really like it. Blushing as he admitted he was glad to hear that, and the sorceress then took the chance to ask him out on a date. Kane hesitated and admitted he was still too young for such things. The sorceress laughed and reassured him that he was taking it too seriously and it had been only a joke. Noticing it was getting late, he suggested they meet for dinner when they were both free, and Kane did not hesitate and gladly agreed. The consultant calmed him and promised he would be held accountable for all his actions, and Marin said she would personally make sure he received a fair punishment. She still had not repaid him for saving her daughter, so if he ever ran into trouble, he could turn to them at the palace. At parting, Marin promised to help him in any way she could because she was grateful, and then she disappeared. She swept through like a whirlwind and was already out of sight. Everything happened much faster than he expected, so they could now move on to the next target. Alan was thrilled and could hardly believe Kane could win over such an incredible girl. At the same time, it matched his image of Mr. Kane. Kane, as always, blushed at her praise. The party had to wake Jeff so they could head to the Merchant Guild together. Randolph greeted them, genuinely pleased by Lord Kane's unexpected arrival and surprised they had not warned him by letter, since he could then have at least arranged an escort. Randolph read it and announced that he had come today with an interesting proposal for them. It had to be admitted, the man knew how to intrigue, and Kane was sure they would like the offer. Randolph had once treated Kane like a child, but now it was clear he had come with a specific goal, which made sense because he was one of the capital's best merchants. Randolph belatedly congratulated Kane on his new position, and Kane thanked him, saying he was grateful not only for himself, but also on behalf of all the former lone traders they had introduced to the charming women. And despite the modest gifts, Randolph sincerely hoped they would bring Kane joy. Randolph, respected by everyone, had arranged gifts for Kane ahead of time, and Kane sincerely thanked him for his thoughtfulness. Kane reminded Randolph they were both busy and suggested getting straight to the point. Facing an urgent shortage of funds, the Carlier territory asked the Merchants Guild for financial help. I was sorry to tell Lord Kane, but his proposal sounded too careless. According to what we knew, the merchants had already taken 10 years' worth of crop tribute as collateral. Given that, it would be unwise for the guild to fund them. Apparently, Randolph misunderstood him. Kane came here not to cooperate, but to demand money from them. He made it clear to the man that however close they were, he was a merchant first. Merchants do not give money away to just anyone. One of them pointed out they were wasting their money, and Kane asked Eileen for a sheet of paper. She handed the signed document to Randolph, and the merchant read it carefully. The tax cut agreement was signed not just by the advisor but also by the court mage. Kane thought it would be good if Randolph handed him the money paid to the capital as taxes to help the needy because he saw it as a fair deal. It would be sensible to use the money stolen by corrupt officials to help those in need. But even as a donation, that sum seemed enormous. Kane asked for one night to discuss everything with his colleagues and promised to give an answer tomorrow. He relied on Randolph and fully agreed with him. As Kane was about to leave, Eileen followed him, but Randolph asked Lord Kane to stay for at least a cup of tea, and Kane refused because his time was worth more than any money. He thanked his friend for his time and said he would wait to hear from him. Just as he was about to leave the Merchant Guild on foot, a merchant carriage pulled up with all the gifts, so he took the chance to ride back. She doubted they could get any money from the guild, but Kane reassured her that there was nothing to worry about. He must pay them money under the tax reduction agreement, and even then his position will improve if he accepts that condition. The hero felt like Jeff and was utterly exhausted. At that moment, the girl decided to make Kane an offer and dropped to her knees before him. Resting his head on her lap would please her, especially if he was tired. He gently laid his head on her lap and apologized for taking the chance, but Eileen only smiled, glowing with happiness. The unpleasant rocking sensation no longer pressed on his ears. In the morning, Stay came in and said good morning to Mr. Kane. She noticed he looked a little tired, but the hero assured her he was fine. They set a clear goal and planned to pay off the debt in 3 years. If he eased up even a little, the Carlier family would be pulled under by debt and crippling interest. But today, they were expecting good news from the Chamber of Commerce, and the girl noticed real confidence in Kane's eyes. She explained that true confidence comes from actions, and expected Mr. Kane to show it while hoping he would relieve her tiredness. People told him to eat more, claiming he would grow taller, but Kane thought height had nothing to do with food. One day when he grows up, he will leave childhood behind, and if he stays short, that will be a real problem. Alan was clearly worried about his future, but Kane could not understand why she worried so much. He agreed that women do not much care for short men. In the end, the boy promised he would eat more from now on and grow taller than his grandfather. She couldn't understand why Kane was in such a hurry, but he asked her to be quiet and promised to eat every last crumb. Alan only warned that Kane would choke if he did not chew properly. Noticing Kane was dirty too, she took out a handkerchief and gently wiped the stain from his face. She gently wiped his lips, and Kane blushed. Seeing how the Lord looked, she asked if she could tidy him up after he finished eating. Combing the young man's hair, the Countess saw he was truly tired, and Kane could no longer deny it. Mr. Kane tried not to twitch, but he could not hold back, barely able to breathe, pinned under Alien's ample breasts. I'm sorry, I can't assist with content that sexualizes minors. I can rewrite it with adult characters or remove the sexual elements if you'd like. Food can feel as comforting as sleep. The girl believed that a short nap during the day would bring something good. Confident she was right, she eased herself down and rested her head on the alien's lap. Years passed and the aliens' words came true. Following Kane's advice, he made them a generous donation and personally brought every penny to their estate. As Mr. Kane noted earlier, these funds were intended to support the residents of their villages, and so far everything has gone according to plan. These events were not just a show of confidence. They were the natural result of earlier decisions. It was not entirely clear to them what Mr. Kane was talking about. All the money came from a plan he had made in advance, which he began before they arrived in the capital with their papers. He had deliberately placed the Randall family's German coat of arms in a prominent spot on the Carlier carriage that brought the donations. Randolph planned to head the Merchants' Guild, but his rival was an experienced merchant who had run the guild for 30 years. Winning the post would be hard for Randolph, so Kane looked for a way to change the situation. Because of Kane's actions, Randolph became a hero who used guild funds to help poor peasants. They will hail him as the hero who saved the Carlier family's lands, and the news will instantly reach the capital itself. Grace and the maids he married off to influential people in the capital will help spread the rumor among the merchants. Jeff has already been sent to meet them and pass on the news. Grace and the other girls decided to leave their home to save the Carly family's lands. But Kane told Aliena that things were actually different. They worried about the family's fate and future, and he promised to take care of it. Grateful, the girls agreed to help him in return. He recognized the young gentleman as a genuinely interesting person and no longer treated him like a child. In the end, he only met the terms of the deal, yet still ended up in debt. Mr. Kane had changed so much that he now had enough influence to become the merchant who would run the entire economy of the Kingdom of Rommers. A relief team arrived from the capital with warm clothes and food for the villagers. This aid will let them get through the winter. This was only the first step toward their future. Noticing Alan holding something, she asked what it was. She smiled and explained it was a gift from her younger sister. Earlier, the sister had found a pretty pebble and given it to Alan. She gave the pebble to her sister and said it was as beautiful as she was. The protagonist learned for the first time that Aylin had a younger sister. Aylin had not told him that her sister disappeared in the famine 5 years earlier, but Mr. Kane was now there. Kane returned to his office and rested his head on the desk. The thought that he had not been there 5 years ago and could not save his sister Elian hurt him. There was no point in regretting the past now, so he had to focus on the present. The same butterfly that had already asked him for forgiveness reappeared before his eyes, coming to remind him that she is the mother of the earth goddess Opria, saying she felt very comfortable and had not left her room at all since he arrived in the capital. The girl reproachfully reminded him he had never visited her either and called him a little rude, then added that if he treated her that way, the place was probably drifting further from God. She was the mother goddess of these lands and would not leave them without a good reason. She asked the hero to imagine leaving his fiancée, who waits faithfully for his return. Opera warned Kane that such behavior could sharply lower his attributes. The hero immediately changed his shoes and sincerely asked forgiveness for his presumption, then turned to his mother, the earth goddess, asking her to be merciful and grant him pardon. He could not understand why things between them always got so complicated, and he hoped his mother had come with good news, but Opera only sighed heavily and reminded him that her visit might mean nothing. He asked her to stop pretending and finally show him the kingdom's screen. He was quite surprised because the number of new residents in his kingdom had suddenly increased. His efforts were showing clear results, and his personal popularity and the people's trust in him kept growing. The capital quickly learned these lands were being given away for free, so many people decided to move here. Personal authority rose, medical care improved, and no one would die of hunger anymore. The other indicators remained uncertain. They proposed pausing to think. Flooding and the coming winter have hurt farming, trade, and entrepreneurship. By spring, we must decide how to restore agriculture and commerce. It was easy to say, but the kingdoms they belonged to had not declined, and the goddess reminded them that the debt interest would slowly rise. The girl begged Lil Khan not to give up, saying Opraja will always be on his side and support him in any situation. The hero joked that it would be great if she could cancel his debts too, since she was so eager to help. But the girl blushed, apologized, and said she could not. Kane had once feared he might not survive the winter. The season was over, and he even celebrated his 11th birthday. But his debt had not decreased at all. Yen's debt had reached 500 billion, and with the new year Kane grew restless again. He wondered where to begin when Zen suddenly spoke to him. He wanted to report that he had received a request from the village of Jin to resolve their conflict. It seemed this had happened before, and the hero did not want to take the case again. He did not realize how easily he could settle their dispute, and assumed the village had no elder. That was true, but the villagers hoped Kane would help them reach an agreement. Tired of being asked about it all the time, he was given one of the village's most beautiful girls as a sign of thanks. Tired of it all, he asked Zen to bring Sebastian here. He entered the young master's office and said the papers showed his grandfather had once lent money to the peasants, asking if he could now demand repayment. Grandfather hesitated for a moment and Kane asked him to answer immediately. The butler said it was now impossible. The hero decided to use the new year as a fresh start and clear all small debts. He ordered Sebastian to gather the maids, and the butler carried out the order without delay. We decided to tax the wealthier residents of the estate and use the money to buy large amounts of food, alcohol, and several cattle. They didn't understand why Kane needed them to cut up that meat. Irene said they were preparing everything for a celebration. That worried the maids least of all, since their conversations were about something else entirely. She thought 10 cows were far too few for so many guests. It was hard to see how that herd could feed thousands at the celebration, since the locals were hard-working peasants with big appetites. Linda suspected Eileen was close to Mr. Kane and knew some gossip, so the girl asked that the knife be kept away from her and admitted plainly that the owner had shared nothing with her. Ever stern, he quickly sliced the meat and ordered Linda to be quiet and get to work. Everyone was amazed at how fast she worked, and Scarlett warned that if they didn't hurry, they wouldn't finish preparing everything for the celebration. The maid noticed they still had many tasks to do. Catherine asked whether the others had heard that the Lord had helped neighboring villages by lending them money. She was stunned to learn that everyone had known about it for a long time, except her. Scarlett angrily told her to take a knife and get to work. Catherine wanted to borrow money from the Lord, but a maid mockingly said it was a foolish idea. People had to ask for help because even their own land could not feed them. The peasants in the garden turned out to be deadbeats who never repaid their debt. A girl named Gertrude grabbed Linda by the neck and said sharply that there is a limit to everything, even rudeness. Linda apologized and took back her words, but Gertrude looked ready to strangle her on the spot. The gentleman had bought meat from people he had lent money to and was now going to feed them the same meat. The girls grew increasingly surprised by the young lord's whims. Noting the girl's wary behavior, he was sure that people who could not even pay a debt would hardly have come to this feast. Mr. Kane said all preparations were finished and praised them for their efforts. It was time to begin, so he told the girl to carry out their plan. After greeting the guests, he thanked everyone for attending that day and introduced himself as the temporary Lord Kane Carlier. Visitors could enjoy tasty food and drinks for free. They were amazed to be able to enjoy so much food and drink they had never tasted before. One man remembered he had never been able to repay his debt to the Lord, which made him sad. That's not all. Attractive maids would gladly cater to each of them. Beautiful maids appeared in luxurious dresses and elegant clothes, pouring alcohol for anyone who wanted it. Scarlett urged the men not to be shy about coming closer, and one guest said the women smelled pleasant. To the men present, the maids seemed true beauties, and they felt as if they were in paradise. While the young women served the guests, Kane turned to the meeting's main topic and asked each person if they could repay the debt, and one man asked for understanding, saying he could only pay the interest because he had to support a family of 8. Kane praised the man for managing to at least pay the interest despite having a large family. To Kane, this showed real decency, and he thought the man a good fellow. Seeing how thin the man was, Kane told him to eat meat more often and offered to get meat for the man's family, which surprised him. Kane called the next man, and when the villagers said most of their livestock had died in the recent flood, Kane immediately dismissed the case. They still had some food left. The next man said the mill was broken so they could not work. The worst blow was the river changing course and harming all the villagers. Kane rejected that too without hesitation and called the next man. They listened carefully to every guest, then split them into 2 groups, those who could pay interest and were given new terms, and those who could not repay the debt. The IOUs of the insolvent were put into a large bowl in the center. Ilian was surprised to see how many there were, as if they reached the sky. She never understood what Mr. Kane planned to do with all those IOUs. Kane's plan was obvious. He intended to burn them. Zen froze, unable to believe his ears, and when he heard Kane order the destruction of the IOUs, everyone realized he was pleased with the decision. The hero asked Sebastian to bring him a small lantern. People could not believe their eyes. The bonds really burned before them, and they did not understand what was happening, so they decided it was just a dream. Kane asked his friends to speak up and explained that the former lord of these lands, his grandfather Li-Pul Carlier, had lent them money to help those affected by natural disasters. Levies were collected to defend their lands, and all the funds were meant to pay for the soldiers and their equipment. As of today, the lord of these lands has decided to free everyone who cannot pay the debts owed to his family. The men could not believe their debts were truly forgiven. One of them cried with relief when he realized he would no longer have to sell his own daughter for a cow. It was hard to believe, as if it were all a dream. The men thought the Lord had heard their prayers and sent them a new ruler, Lord Kane himself. They wanted to be sure the young lord was firm in his decision, since he had burned IOUs for 10 million pounds, and the hero asked him to listen, saying their family was already buried in huge debts, and even a few million would not change things for the better. The Carlier family was already in decline, and if those people had large interest-bearing debts, they would likely have fled without paying anything. The family's lands needed reliable people to help restore stability, become prosperous, and pay taxes on time. He pointed out that he had gathered not only debtors, but also people who could pay the interest, because he needed to bring everyone together, and when money is involved, no one wants to be left out. If Kane had quietly forgiven debts only for those who could not pay it, would have caused fights and misunderstandings later. Not only did he speak for the Lord and win broad approval, he also helped everyone relax and honestly admit their financial troubles, giving each person support and attention. Kane reviewed the list of all debtors, separating those who still had money from those already broke, then raised. He strengthened his reputation while working through a mountain of bad debts. People say his action was a contribution to the future, because those he rescued from the debt trap will be indebted to him for life. When Zen realized this, his eyes lit up. They were impressed by the young lord and said it was simply a brilliant idea, because he had once read the biography of Min Yaojun. Earlier, Alien said Lord Kane was an exceptionally distinguished man. I noticed that every time Eileen mentioned Lord Kane, her eyes lit up more, and she looked increasingly like a girl head over heels in love. Holding back a blush, Scarlett asked her not to pay attention to Linda's sharp remarks. After everything that happened, she thought they should reconsider their view of the current lord. The soldiers owed their lord a large sum, but he showed leniency, letting the debt go and proving he could be trusted. All along, they had simply underestimated Mr. Kane. Scarlett hoped Eileen would not keep a man with such a brilliant mind to herself. Realizing that was true, she wanted Eileen to take them all to Mr. Kane immediately. Enjoying the long-awaited calm and silence, Mr. Kane was glad the annoying, hallucination-like buzzing nearby was gone. A goddess appeared before him and reminded him she was no phantom of his imagination. She was his tender lover, the mother goddess of the Earth opera. The hero smiled and asked her to tell him when she had become his lover. Knowing she already suspected his feelings, the girl told him not to be shy, and he replied confidently that he had no intention of blushing. They asked her coldly to finally describe their situation. Opera only noted that he was still not a romantic and opened the kingdom's statistics, to see how much his reputation and the public's trust had grown. O'Brien was sure his actions would make him more popular every year. That was all fine, of course, but the hero could not understand why his health suddenly got worse. It wasn't about him at all. Western bandits had become active again, and since the start of the year their attacks had grown much more frequent. The hero wanted to check how much debt remained, so the girl made sure he knew the exact amount. After a while, the debt grew by another 43 million pounds, leaving Kane unable to understand where it came from. In the end, it remained unclear whether they had reduced the previous debt. They only showed him the final debt figure. The hero told her to just disappear, and she promised to leave soon. But before leaving, she wanted to thank him for all his efforts. She floated over to the young man, kissed his cheek gently, and as she dissolved into the air, said it was her thanks. Just then, Aylin knocked on the door and politely asked to come in. She hoped Mr. Kane was free, and the young man kindly invited her inside. Several maids accompanied her and apologized for the unexpected visit. Aylin said all the girls were moved by his gesture and wanted to thank him in person. Zero realized these girls were Aylin's close friends and believed everything had been possible because each of them had worked hard together, so he sincerely praised them for the excellent job they did today. She bowed and politely asked him not to exaggerate, since their work was nothing compared to his achievements. The Carlier family servants always did their best to ease Mr. Kane's daily burdens and worries. The hero gladly noted Scarlet's zeal and observed her sincere, lively nature. Scarlet herself was surprised that Mr. Kane knew her name, but in the end it felt natural since everyone in the estate felt like one big family. Catherine stood out with beautiful golden curls, Bertruda with long, silky black hair, Frances had short chestnut hair, and little Jemmy had bright blue eyes that were hard to miss. Everyone fell silent in surprise, and the alien couldn't recover. Despite being busy, Kane knew every name, even Linda, whom for some reason everyone always forgets. When Linda stood up, someone told her that Mr. Kane had mentioned her, and she replied to the young lord that such a description sounded cruel. The celebration was a success thanks to their hard work. If they wanted a reward to show their thanks, they could ask for it. However, the hero reminded them he cannot provide money now because their lands are facing financial hardship. She dared to state her bold request and asked permission to speak. Irene grew worried, but Kane reassured her that everything was fine and that he was ready to hear any of their wishes. With Mr. Kane's consent, Scarlet asked for a hug as a reward. He could not refuse her. Scarlet apologized and hugged the lord, pressing her soft, firm breasts to his face. She told Scarlet it wasn't fair, but it looked surprisingly interesting, and the other maids wanted to try it too. She asked the girls to stop, then decided to try it herself. Mr. Kane moved closer and asked the girls to come forward one by one. It was a truly unusual sight for him. Mr. Kane's kindness impressed them, and he was not just friendly, but inspired complete trust. The girls didn't expect Scarlet to ask for something like that. It seemed this boy had truly won her heart. Alien thought it was rude to attack Mr. Kane that way, but the others agreed she should not be the only one to enjoy his company, and she had no right to stop others from talking with him. A butler appeared in the corridor, and Scarlet immediately ordered everyone to line up. Sebastian asked Alina what they were doing in the young master's study. Elena explained they only wanted to thank him for what he did today, and nothing more. Sebastian asked them not to make noise in the corridor, and the girls immediately complied. A month had passed since the banquet marking the cancellation of debts. To bring order to the estates, they had to find the cause of the troubles and look into the whole history of these lands. Zen struggled in the library, so Kane decided to find him an assistant. The situation had plenty of funny moments. A knock sounded at Kane's office door, and he invited the visitor in. The door opened. The visitor apologized for the disturbance, and Kane immediately realized it was serious. Unfortunately, his hunch was right. Bandits had suddenly become active in the western lands of Galley, so the general urgently requested reinforcements. Until now, his cousin had handled all foreign affairs, but as the new head of these lands, he had to take on responsibility for military conflicts. Remember the events 2 weeks ago. Operia had already mentioned those bandits then, and their attacks had grown much more frequent since the start of the year. If they had ignored it, access to medical care could have been wiped out. About 4,000 soldiers occupy these lands and are spread across the territory, with 2,000 concentrated in the central regions, and the hero asks Sebastian if 300 fighters will be enough to support the front, and Sebastian assures him it is more than enough. Kane then handed him a note asking to send reinforcements and 300 soldiers west. Frankly, he did not want to hire new soldiers because he had no money for it. And if things get worse, not only people, but this land will suffer. According to this list, many experienced warriors once served under his grandfather's command, but most are now unfit for battle from old age, while the rest left service after control of the lands passed to Kane's father, and the hero seethed at his father, who had ruined his whole life. Of course, Good asks Sebastian to join as well. At that moment, he simply lacked any extraordinary cunning. The hero could not see the point of pretty maidservants when he could have skilled feudal lords or brave commanders instead. The shortage of capable people was an urgent problem that had to be solved quickly. Once the hero finished the paperwork, he arranged a meeting with his great-grandfather and took a short rest until the elder returned. Voices on the street said a messenger had arrived. Kane rushed down the stairs to find out what had caused the commotion. At the bottom, he saw Eileen and asked her what was happening. Trying to help the wounded messenger, Aelin urged the young lord to leave immediately. Kane was confused and had no idea what was happening. A wounded messenger said 10,000 soldiers were coming this way right now. The hero assumed they were troops from the west because the messenger's wounds were severe. He immediately asked his servants to help the man. The messenger said Goliath sought to create chaos. Goliath was a powerful warrior from a western village known for its loyalty to the ruler. Sebastian could not understand why a man who had always paid his taxes honestly would suddenly turn against the authorities and take up banditry. Soon the giant reached the lord's estate and ordered him to come out, threatening to skin him alive if he did not appear. Giant, muscular Mangoliat, the 42-year-old leader of the western village. That settled it. Kane quickly understood what was going on and decided talking to him would not be difficult. Jeff asked to accompany the young master, but Kane declined, saying he did not need his services right now. Kane tells the girls to calm down and simply trust him, and asks them to bring him a chair. Jeff was at a loss and did not know what to do, but Sebastian insisted they had no choice but to trust the unknown. Goliath's behavior, though, seemed very strange. One of the heroes moved closer to the head to make sure it really was Goliath. Kin was about to listen closely, but Goliath did not realize an unknown boy was standing before him. He said he is the son of Cain Carlier, the lord of these lands. Now the estate's temporary head, he learned about Goliath from his own butler. Stunned to learn he was Lord Leopold's grandson, he could not be calmed even by family ties. In Cain's place, I would have urged him to compose himself, since I could not understand why such a respected man acted so wildly, and it seemed he had no idea what they had suffered at the hands of nobles and officials. Apologizing, he said he had only recently received the title of Lord. Cain understood that Goliath would never move against the Carlier family without a good reason. Whether he gave it or not, help would still reach those who needed it. Cain only wanted to use his influence. The young man asks Goliath to tell him what they managed to do. The former lord was almost a god. After he died and Cain's father took over, things fell apart. Greedy officials ignored the bans. They hid the priestess of the Mother Earth temple, Agatus's shrine, which had been revered long before the Carlier family took these lands. If Mr. Leopold were alive, Goliath would let him make his own decisions. There is no place for that despot as lord. Now Cain understood what had really happened and what their motives were. Determined to rid the sacred place of every corrupt official who dared disgrace it, and to bring their heads to the goddess as a sacrifice. If that is true, they deserve punishment for their deeds, and the hero thought Goliath should be rewarded for such an act. He said his father was ill and did not know what was happening here, so he came instead. Valkane was determined to change these lands. He promised to visit every corner of the land himself, punish corrupt officials personally, and strip them of power. At the same time, Cain was glad that the residents themselves had taken the first step to cleanse the land. Cain praised Goliath for a job well done and asked him to accept thanks from himself, his father, and his grandfather. Hearing that, Goliath was so surprised he accidentally dropped his sword. Aurel wanted to apologize for all the pain his father caused during his rule, and now he rules these lands and has promised that by the end of the year all guilty officials will be punished and ordinary people will finally breathe easier. Goliath realized the man might say anything under threat of death, so he wasn't sure he could trust him. Then the hero decided to prove his sincerity and asked Zen to bring an item from the storeroom. Seeing all the wealth the Card family had generously given him, he was stunned. Convinced it was just shiny junk, he at first planned to sell the pile to merchants, but they valued the treasures at tens of millions, which surprised Goliath. Determined to make sure the merchants sold all that junk for the highest possible price, he suggested Goliath go with the merchants and their goods to the capital and return with the money. Some people thought he might take the money, but Cain wasn't worried because he was sure Goliath would use it all to help the locals. I couldn't understand why this little one behaved more like a girl, but her actions clearly showed she had Mr. Leopold's blood. He ordered Gurai's brother to approach the new lord and ask if he could be trusted. Gurai, however, was convinced he could. The young men also did not doubt his words. Goliath squeezed Cain's hand, and the boy said he completely trusted them. Speaking loudly to everyone, he said they had heard everything, and that their task now was to escort the merchants to the capital, earn a lot of money, and return home. Terror gripped them. They did not know who the strangers were or what was happening around them. Alien was even more surprised that they were laughing. Jeff never doubted the young gentleman would manage and was deeply moved by his courage. To him, the young master was simply an unmatched hero. Eilina decided they still had a long way to go to be worthy chambermaids, and agreed that Lord Cain was truly remarkable. Only a few hours seemed to have passed, and Goliath's army had already returned the money to the Carlier family estate. He said they had only one thing left to do, but Goliath did not know what it was. Now their land was a boiling cauldron of hell, with sinners constantly trying to break free. The defenders had very few skilled warriors to fight them. Cain knew Goliath had been loyal to the Carlier family for years, paying taxes faithfully since his grandfather's time, but the family's actions had cost them Goliath's trust, and Cain regretted it because he understood how much Goliath valued these lands and the people who live here. Acting on behalf of the Carlier family, he decided to give all the gold to him. Cain asked that the money be used to buy supplies and equip a large army to clear their lands of bandits. He was surprised that Mr. Cain trusted him with such an important task. Initially, he resisted, but things turned out differently, and Goliath was genuinely grateful to him. Refusing such an offer was impossible because the money would let them achieve a great deal. Tears of joy rolled down the man's stern face. They could not only destroy those cutthroats, but also feed and shelter everyone in need on this land. Cain decided to put the funds to good use and asked the general to stand. He asked his comrades to collect all their weapons, but they were mostly just a pile of scrap metal. In one hand was a sword that looked more like a shard than a real weapon. Cain knew he couldn't defeat an enemy with that wreck. Those blades were only good for melting down and would become the base for a new, true blade. They couldn't tell what he intended to do with the blades, but Goliath told them to be silent and watch his every move. The hero used his alchemical magic to enchant the swords with earth magic. When the steel giant Goliath was reborn, he finally realized the full power of Lord Carlisle. With his own strength, in just a few seconds he restored dozens of cannons to their original form, and we must not underestimate that power. Deeply moved, the man lifted the young lord into his arms. The young lord promised to reward them generously. The man felt such generosity exceeded all expectations. The other warriors, now armed with new weapons, were delighted and convinced that serving Lord Cain was the right choice. Aurel apologized to Goliath and asked him to return the weapon to Sebastian, although it seems he never actually said that. Jeff and Aline worried about the young lord, but Randolph reassured them that he was simply tired. He asked Aylin and Jeff to take the young lord to his room. The man said he should have contacted them earlier, but it was too late to change anything. Signed Cain Carlier, only 11 years old, used alchemical power and the knowledge of past and present lives to raise an army of 10,000 warriors. A greater test still awaited Cain. All the maids gathered around the bed where the king slept, his head on Alina's lap, and she asked everyone to stay quiet. Lindy thought it was unfair that once again Alina was the one taking care of him. The Carlier family estate became a refuge for 10,000 of Goliath's soldiers. Each year its supplies were constantly replenished and grew. Life was busy here, which was not surprising because everyone knew about Cain's incredible alchemy skills. It was easier than expected because the weapon already had the right shape, so restoring it was not difficult. Zen noticed Cain's being modest again, and even thought Cain's was giving them sincere hospitality and food, and according to ancient Chinese tales, those who feed the hungry become heroes, so the act made a real impression. But Cain's chose not to argue, and gave in to Zen's words. Cain's approached the young master and asked him to spare a few minutes to talk. Payne did not object and invited him into his office. Sebastian approached Cain for a reason. He wanted to know if Cain was going back to the capital. Cain noticed Sebastian's odd behavior as soon as he arrived, because Sebastian had been avoiding him on purpose. Sebastian was genuinely surprised that Cain had figured it out. Guy noticed that alchemists can see the true nature not only of things, but of people, which made him realize Sebastian had been hiding something from him all along. His expression only confirmed the suspicion. They smiled at him and advised him not to take everything so literally, since Sebastian had put so much effort into serving his grandfather. But Sebastian assumed the young man was only joking, and that was wrong. The hero realized everyone expected Cain to run away from his problems and leave this place. Cain had no answer. Still a child, he was also an aristocrat. His father was gravely ill, his grandfather had already died, and his great-grandfather was too old to perform his duties. He did not care at first about what would happen to this place if he escaped, but over time, attitudes changed. Determined to pay off the huge debt and save the land and its people with money. They looked down on my life and work, treating land management and caring for people with contempt. Maybe things really worked differently before. Some commoners scorned money, calling it a corruption of the human soul. But those who said that were not saints, just ordinary fools. The talisman could bring both good and harm. It all depended on whose hands it ended up in. Everyone was ready to fight for the golden amulet held in the palm, and that made sense. For many people, life depended on money. But for Cain, it was more of a mirror showing a person's true nature. Cain flipped a coin and it landed softly on his palm. The hero wanted Sebastian to keep supporting his choice because he planned to use the money to help people and live a happy life. And Sebastian realized the terrible misunderstanding and sincerely apologized to the young master. He had seen how ruined the estate was and did not want the young master to waste his best years restoring the neglected land, but deciding for him would be deeply selfish. Christian knelt and sincerely apologized to the old man for his stubbornness, but Cain did not consider him guilty. Still, the boy was very young, so he would need the support of his elders, and he truly relied on Sebastian. Zero hoped his request would be accepted, and Sebastian promised to do his best, but they still had to prepare for the next day. He smiled, admitted Sebastian was right, and trusted him completely. At midnight, Cain heard the door creak and a soft whisper from an alien calling for its master. Cain couldn't understand why she had come to him again in the middle of the night and remembered their earlier meeting when she had taken on her nightly role. Maybe Sebastian had sent her again. Meanwhile, Eileen slipped up to Mr. Cain quietly. When the girl raised her hands, the boy told her to stop, and she fell onto the bed right in front of him. Cain had no idea what she was planning this time. Catherine reassured her it was the best she could do for him. Pain urged her to accept that the kidnapping would have ended the same for her because she would have been caught. Tomorrow he must go through these lands to sort out the mess, but he will not fight on the front line. Goliath, Jeff, and other knights will travel with him. Eileen insisted on going with him to care for Cain, but he tried to persuade her that a dangerous journey was no place for a defenseless girl because enemies could kidnap her or do worse. Alina couldn't understand why he refused to take her with him, but that was out of the question because she had no role on the battlefield. The girl assumed Cain was probably scared too, and he would lie if he denied it. If they kept ignoring the bandits, everyone would be in danger, and Cain could not allow that. Overcome by emotion, she rushed into Lord Cain's arms, barely holding back tears. She could not hide how worried she was for him, and admitted that if he left and did not come back, her heart would simply stop. Lord Cain felt awkward and thought she would sooner smother him in her arms than let him die. He asked her to calm down and assured her he did not plan to die there. He told her he'd never lied and gently put his hands on her shoulders. Without letting Keelan speak a word, Cain suddenly kissed the surprised girl on the lips. Cain urged her to promise she would trust him and wait for him, and the alien woman promised. Aelin wanted to tell him something, but Cain reminded her she had already promised and now had to keep it. She blushed and admitted she wanted to do something kind for him. Right now, he could ask for something else, but above all, he wants to rest with his head on her lap. I hope it was not a burden to her, and the girl sincerely let Mr. Cain rest on her lap for as long as he wished. The next morning, Cain went to nearby villages and urged everyone able to fight to take up arms with promises of a brighter future. Cain split the people into two groups and sent the elderly, the infirm, women with children, and anyone unable to fight to shelter at the Carlier estate. He called young, strong men to join his army. His efforts won another 300 soldiers, and made Goliath the army's general. Meanwhile, the Carlier lands fell into turmoil from bandit attacks, uprisings in the northwest, and frequent revolts in the south and north, with the east largely untouched. Cain decided to go himself to restore order in the domains. Meanwhile, reinforcements Sebastian had gathered all night joined Carlier's army. They came willingly, having already served under Grand Polly in Pilda, and were veterans, true old-school warriors. Under Captain Alberta's command, 30 more experienced fighters joined the Carlier family's army. Soon, Cain gathered capable commanders around him who had their own soldiers. In total, their army grew by 500 new warriors. Goliath led the infantry detachment, and 500 horsemen were under Jeff's command. He decided to start the crackdown in the quietest district, the eastern fortress of House Carlier. Clenching his fist, he urged everyone to show House Carlier's strength and crush their enemies. Under Goliath's command, the infantry confidently took control of village after village. The hero received news that Goliath's army had captured the eastern castle, and with the eastern lands now theirs, he decided to hear proposals for further action, while 65-year-old former guard knight Alberto said that with the east secured, they could finally establish contact with the locals and subjects, whose number had been about 67,000 but was now roughly 10,000 fewer. Their headquarters were now moved to the center of the eastern sector. The warrior asked to go north with Jeff and to send Goliath south. Despite the rebels' numerical advantage, they lacked proper training, which gave our heroes the edge. The small number of knights was due to insufficient combat training. He considered them truly gifted and was glad such people still existed. Thanks to Sebastian, he had the chance to meet them, which made him feel grateful. The butler added shyly that they had all willingly followed Cain, taken by his ambitions. After the victory in the east, the Carlier family's headquarters was moved right into the center. The army continued to crush the uprising with unprecedented speed. A month had passed since Cain left the estate, and now the heroes were about to face their most dangerous enemies. It was clear to Cain that things in the north and south were going well, and Jeff and Goliath would be back soon. The warriors acknowledged they would not have made such progress without their presence, and the credit was entirely theirs. Despite lacking money, power, or battle experience, he truly wanted peace for the land. Others wanted the same, so they united and achieved much. He may have thought they would obey him just because he was strong. A man had been watching him for a whole month, and the young aristocrat was truly unusual, carrying the spirit of Leopold Carlier and always treating others with respect, listening closely to every word of advice, praise, or even criticism. Yet there was one important difference between them. Leopold personally led the army and fought bravely alongside his soldiers. Cain knew his weaknesses, so he always asked those stronger in those areas for help and used every available resource. This is how a truly ideal commander acts. Noting that Cain had done an excellent job as commander, he said it had gotten them this far. Cain smiled, and admitted words like that give him hope. They reported to Lord Cain that 300 armed men had quietly crept up on their camp. The old man advised him to leave the defense to them and flee before dawn. Cain immediately thought that several of the newcomers must be experienced commanders. Smiling, he agreed it was true, but said it was not his place to join this battle. The generals could not understand what Cain was planning, but the hero assured them it would become clear now. Using alchemical magic, he created clay golems. They proposed using these creatures as the vanguard. Made of clay, they could not be harmed. The generals were impressed that Cain could control the golems. New golems emerged from the ground, looking genuinely menacing. In that situation, Albert Ototha said he could handle the golems and solemnly promised to protect Lord Cain. The boy smiled and also assured them he would not leave them in trouble. Cain was genuinely surprised to see such enormous golems and decided his alchemy had improved greatly after that trick weapon. When soldiers saw the golems near the headquarters, they panicked and fled, shouting that monsters were attacking. Bandera's men laughed and told the enemy to run straight into their hands. Pain ordered the other warriors to wait for the enemy at the edge of the forest. The brave defenders quickly broke the enemy's resistance. The attackers acted like inexperienced recruits and paid no attention to their surroundings. They shouted that the enemies were pathetic rookies without a commander, and no mercy would be shown to anyone who dared attack their lord. Commander Alberto felt an incredible surge of adrenaline as if suddenly swept back into memories from 20 years ago, and without wasting a second, he lunged forward, slicing the air with his sword. They thought they could outplay us and escape another way, but in the end, they were trapped themselves, just as Lord Cain predicted. He could not understand how Cain could be so sharp at that age, since his own grandson, the same age, was nowhere near as quick and lost in thought. He heard Lord Cain tell Sir Alberto calmly that it was over. Word spread quickly. Mr. Jeff's cavalry fully controlled the north, and Mr. Goliath's infantry held the south. At noon today, the commanders of both units planned to come to headquarters in person to report their gains. Mr. Cain said there was only one step left, the final battle with the West, and stressed they had reached it because of everyone's efforts. But Alberto thought they did not yet deserve such high praise. He stepped into Cain's tent and could not tell what it lacked. The hero told Zen to return to the manor if he did not like the local conditions. Cain thought that had been rather rude of him, since he had only been worried about the Lord. Left alone in the chaos, he decided not to argue with Zen. He hadn't planned to die here. Fortune was on their side, but their army now had only 20,000 warriors while the enemy had 25,000. Zen noticed that among the foes were seasoned fighters like Jeff, Goliath, and others. He pointed out that Sebastian is much stronger than him, and in a crisis they can use Sebastian's strength. Right now their forces have both territorial and numerical advantages. They must also remember another risk. The soldiers might suddenly flee the battlefield. Zen remembered with horror that when they first appeared in this country, the troops had already abandoned the field. Cain could not blame them. These men were ordinary peasants with no military training, so the outcome was predictable and should have been planned for in advance. They were responsible to their subordinates and to the citizens, but if anything happened, they'd handle problems as they came up. Zen saw that as needless bother and believed commanders only needed to stay in the command tent. Cain did not want to be here at all, and if he had a choice, he would not be standing in this spot. The young man sighed, deciding he could at least complain to Zen. To Zen, Mr. Cain now seemed like a carefree young master. They assumed that if the West fell, the unrest would end. That was true, but the western lands caused the most trouble because Count Palladium's army camp was there. He convinced the people of the West that he took the Carlier family's lands only to protect them from the Lord's oppression, and the eastern, southern, and northern lands obey him while his army numbers over 25,000, though most of the soldiers are simple peasants. Perla had a well-trained army of nearly 20,000 warriors. Even if enemies attacked from all sides, they would take heavy losses. A proposal for peace talks had already been sent, but Count Palladium appears to have ignored it. That meant an open confrontation was unavoidable. If they do not defeat the West, they will not be able to change these lands. Everyone was convinced Leopold was dead, and even if Cain gathered as many peasants as he could, he would still have to prove that the era of Lord Carlier Iroch was over. Meanwhile, the hero told the generals they were heading to the western lands. Soon on the rolling hills, the Carlier family's 25,000 troops will clash with Count Palladium's 20,000. Carlier's forces are mostly peasants, while Count Palladium's are seasoned fighters. They knew that if things continued like this, defeat was inevitable. Goliath's infantry held their ground far more firmly than Cain expected. Goliath announced loudly that this was their homeland, and they would fight to their last breath, not retreating from the enemy. Unbreakable spirit and unity among ordinary peasants gave them the strength to get this far. He realized the current enemies were far more dangerous than those they had faced before, and his army would not last long against true warriors. They said Jeff was slowly gaining ground, but if the battle dragged on, they were unlikely to win. Cain thought breaking through on the Count's land would be difficult, so he asked to bring in Goliath's infantry and send them to Jeff. I can't ask to call Greher. Goliath sent his infantry to support Jeff's detachment and did everything to keep the soldiers' morale up, while his younger brother Gaioriah was tasked with a covering unit to move through every village where the enemy army had stopped and burn their supply depots to reduce the enemy's fighting ability. They hoped these actions would break the enemy's spirit and shake his faith in victory, but things went the other way. Losses were smaller than expected, so the enemy, determined to win at any cost, spent large sums to quickly rebuild the army. Lord Cain's warriors reported their reinforcements had grown by another 20,000 soldiers. The hero could not understand what Count Paladin wanted or why he had no limits. The young man gathered everyone and decided they would destroy Paladin's army in one decisive battle. Over the 3 days, Zero did not waste any time and was sure the Count would regret it. Reinforcements advanced to meet Lord Cain's army and were met by Goliath's infantry, who charged without fear. Goliath himself had called for the enemy to attack and was ready and eager. He held a massive axe forged by Lord Cain himself to feel the full power of Goliath. The soldiers regained their fighting spirit and decided they should move forward too. Amanda realized Goliath was so strong he had forced his way straight to the center. Jeff was ordered to watch them. Given command of the left and right flanks, he listened closely to the commander. Even facing an army of 40,000, the soldiers' morale stayed unbroken. Cain ordered them to keep pressing the enemy to force them into a better position. The plan was to drive the entire enemy force into a homemade trap built from discarded barricades. Preparing the ambush took about 3 days because building the trap required a lot of work. The enemy deliberately used frightened soldiers, and Cain created extra golems to block every escape route, so half the council's army panicked and could not figure out what to do. Goliath offered them one last duel, saying that after it, he would crush the fighter's will and return home. He agreed to it only on one condition: give him a horse, and then he promised he would deal with each of them. A sturdy stallion. Goliath introduced himself as the general of the Carlier family army and demanded that their commander-in-chief come out to him. A formidable, majestic figure stepped out from among the soldiers, General Blaise Duraf of the Palladium family army, and walked confidently toward the enemy. It was claimed that old Carlier was already dead and that their wives and children were starving and dying in poverty, but if they submit to Count Palladium, everyone can leave without bloodshed. Uncertain about their count's intentions, they were proud of their land and wanted to choose their own ruler. Cain Carly was a smart young man who had the power to breathe new life into these lands and refused to bow to the corrupt nobles who kept people in fear and only wanted power and glory. Having chosen a side, he faced the Count's threat to kill him and Lord Cain with the spear that had already killed 7 famed warriors of Carly's army. Goliath grabbed his heavy axe and headed toward his opponent with determination. Aiming his spear at the enemy, he ordered Goliath to prepare to die. Fate decided to show him what ordinary villagers could do. The generals locked eyes, and Goliath, with a single swift motion, split the Count's spear in 2. The Count's face showed genuine confusion, unable to grasp how he had been defeated in an instant by a single blow. Stunned and lost in thought, the Count fell from his horse to the ground. Goliath's axe moved at incredible speed and was far from a single weak strike. Goliath loudly told the enemies that he had killed their General Blaise with his own hand and challenged anyone who disagreed to try to avenge his death. Stunned, the general could not understand how he had caused Blaise's death, but somehow Redneck managed to kill the invincible general and the army saw him as a real monster. So the soldiers quickly realized that if even their leader could not stand against him, they had no chance. They realized that even after their general was killed, fear stayed, and with it their will to keep fighting faded. But this is only temporary because with a new leader, they could become a serious threat again. They wanted to be sure they were doing the right thing, and Alberto assured them that this was the truth of war. The soldiers were not like Goliath or the others, yet they marched to slaughter again and again. Count Palladium ignored their letter, and that was the result of their lord's choice. Cain realized that if he relaxed his guard for a moment, the army would seize the chance. Driven by a fierce desire for peace and prosperity for this land, he was ready to take on all his family's sins to atone for them. Goliath taunted the enemies, who did not dare reply. They ignored the mercy their lord had given them, but Jeff Goliath Gurai and many commanders serving under Alberto appreciated that kindness. Palladia's army was shrinking by the second. In Lord Cain's name, the commanders had no intention of showing any mercy to their enemies. Thanks to Cain Carlier, Count Palladius's prepared, well-trained army was defeated. He was grateful to every warrior because they had eliminated the main threat from the Count's forces. They did not fully defeat every enemy, but the story of this battle will spread like lightning across all lands for the cause. The Carlier army possessed incredible weapons, and its ranks included immortal giants. And as Cain had predicted, rumors of Carlier's power spread instantly across Count Palladium's lands. The problem remained unresolved, and the tension did not ease. Cain feared the enraged count, angered by his defeat, might throw all his forces into battle, an army of 100,000 soldiers. To prevent that at the last moment, Cain sent a messenger to the count's land with a new proposal for a truce. The court sorceress Marin Ruffs served as the envoy. She warned the lord that rejecting the truce would be taken by her as a hostile act against her close friend. The count seemed to understand and did not object. The girl still hadn't thanked him for saving her friend, genuinely wanting to help Cain, and the boy could hardly imagine what would have happened if he hadn't saved Lady Meow then, since fate seemed to be on his side this time. The moment Cain thought of God, Opriot appeared before him again. Seeing Mott again gave Cain no comfort. Opriot smiled and admitted he was clumsily showing his affection again. He seemed to already know that Cain was a real man. Opriot had also heard about Marin's success and came to show him the scoreboard in person. His decisions had greatly improved healthcare, which did not surprise Cain. Having already settled things with the paladin, he was more worried about the decline in irrigation, farming, and trade. Cain thought war might be the cause. Instead, their numbers grew, and the girl reminded him he was creating not just weapons, but new targets. He admitted he had missed the most important thing, that their debt had almost disappeared, and that was wonderful. Many wealthy merchants in the western region decided to join the Palladium. Cain then banished them and seized their wealth. Surprised, he said it was too cruel, but Cain insisted their enemies were the real monsters who profited from war and the suffering of ordinary people and deserved punishment. These people had defected to the enemy. Guy could not call them pure evil, but admitted their actions were not good and that they themselves might be to blame, since they should have been stopped from the start. They brought their troubles on themselves. It was the true price of their actions, an eye for an eye. No one forced them to go to the enemy for personal profit and to profit from others' grief. Cain decided to use the money he had earned to pay his debts, and Opriot realized the hero was far from flawless. Pointing out that such words could hurt him, she asked him to stop treating people so harshly. She said it should not have been done that way, and that she could have paid for it. The girl reminded him of his promise. He sighed deeply, feeling how tired he was. After apologizing to Mr. Cain, he checked that he was still awake. Mr. Cain let him in and asked him to leave tea here. The hero frowned as he sipped the still hot tea. He could not recall anyone among his acquaintances with such a squeaky voice and frail build. There was no sugar nearby, though the man said he had already sweetened the tea so the hero should not worry. Realizing he had miscalculated because he usually doesn't put sugar in his tea, he asked the stranger what he really wanted. The man immediately drew his swords. Someone tried to attack Cain, so he went to find out what was happening. Apparently the stranger ignored him, so Cain had to defend himself with whatever was at hand. The hero already felt this could happen to him. In a past life, he likely would have bought a jujitsu training manual on sale. The little goddess tried to stun the stranger with a blow to the head to throw him off. She strictly forbade him to even think about attacking her enchanted baby. He tried many ways to drive Odio away, but never dared to hit her. The hero was surprised the mercenary had noticed the Apriya and saw it as his chance. The time had come for an equal exchange. Controlling alchemy had made him master of everything around him, so the hero fashioned a sword from a candle holder. Just as he was ready to fight him on equal terms, he suddenly noticed his tent was engulfed in flames. Outside, everyone was worried about Lord Cain. The commander ran in to see Lord Cain and asked what had happened. Cain said a killer had broken in on him, and there was nowhere left to run. Surrounded by a group of soldiers, he was sternly ordered to lay down his weapon, or they warned they would use force. Surrounded by complete silence, he seemed to choose the second option. The mercenary was finally caught, and the soldiers breathed a sigh of relief because Mrs. Cain had handled the situation skillfully. Now they faced two tasks: put out the fire and question the prisoner. Cain was surprised to learn the killer was a girl. She was about his age, and Cain couldn't understand what she was doing here. With tears in her eyes, she shouted that it was their fault. It turned out she worked for the Lafore Company, which had everything taken from it and whose employees were forced into exile. Apparently, they did not even realize their company had joined the Pavladian county and was supporting the war. So many villages burned because of them they could not be counted. Innocent people died while the company kept profiting. The girl looked at Cain in confusion, not sure what he meant. He considered that behavior a betrayal of the Carlier family and told them to be glad he had left them with nothing instead of taking their lives. The girl found it strange that Cain could say such terrible things so calmly while still a child. She only regretted not being able to slit his throat, though she had been very close. The hero wanted to know what tied her to the company and asked her name. Her name was Sheila. For the first time, the young man heard the name and learned the girl served Lady Lillian. He deeply respected his grandfather and kept supporting him financially even after the plump man gained power. But when the gentleman finally ran out of money, the Carlier family turned away, and only Mrs. Lillian stayed loyal. Robbers kidnapped Sheila and sold her into slavery, leaving her unsure where she had ended up. She told Cain to remember that even if she died there, the dark spirit would keep bringing her back to him until Cain died. The Lord shoved a gag into her mouth and threw her to the ground, then suggested to Lord Cain they get rid of her and pressed a sword to her throat, but Cain ordered them to wait. He regretted that his master had been put in that situation because of her and secretly hoped to ignore her hostility and find Lillian. Once he finds Lillian, she will spend some time in the dungeon of his estate to calm herself. He asks the commander to treat the captive with respect, and tears fill the girl's eyes. Kender asked the young master to apologize, saying that if he had seen the girl earlier, none of this would have happened. Cain refused to apologize because he had asked to be left alone. Realizing ordinary means could not settle the family debts, he considered what sacrifices he would make to save his life and these lands. The fares exceeded expectations, so it was time to plan the next move. Guy told Zen that now was the best time to return to the estate, and Zen agreed completely. A month had passed since Guy and his army had been fighting on the front lines, and about 7 days ago news arrived of a victory in the west. Everyone was relieved that Lord Cain was finally coming home. The Palladium district had been defeated and the bandits wiped out, so his return was certain. All Elian could do was guess when exactly he would arrive. A maid ran up to them and immediately began saying that Lord Cain had been attacked by an assassin, and Alan, who had really hoped he was all right, then heard from the girl that it was true, and that Lord Cain had managed to defeat the attacker with his alchemy. Lydia sighed and still did not understand what her friend was doing, since she had only shared some good news with Alina, and Linda grabbed the little rascal by the ear and said they were going to clean the kitchen while the girl begged to be let go, saying it hurt. Helena was cleaning the yard when a wind picked up and she heard the clatter of hooves in the distance, which could only mean the master had returned to the manor. The carriage pulled up near Eileen and Mr. Cain stepped out. He always looked forward to coming home, where he was warmly welcomed. Running to him, she threw her arms around him and greeted him joyfully on his safe return. Even after Cain promised he would come back, she could not stop worrying. He hugged her in return and whispered that he was home now, by her side.